Hello, fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is your invitation to slow down, to quiet your mind with soft storytelling, whether you're preparing to sleep or just need calm company while working, cooking, driving, or even showering with headphones on. If you enjoy this kind of long-form science, I ask you to like and subscribe. It's not just for me. It helps this channel reach others who might also find comfort in learning, and maybe even conquer the world with a little more knowledge and calm. I'd also love to hear in the comments, do you listen before bed, or while doing something else? Or perhaps tell me what place and time you're watching from, and if you drift off during the story, don't worry. I've put chapter timestamps in the description so you can easily return to where you left off. The full journey is worth it, from start to end. This is a channel for soft science, not wild speculation. Humble history told slowly. We don't have all the answers, but we do our best to bring them to light. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now, let's begin. Cult of the Skull, the first cities of the dead, 8,800 to 6,500 BC. What does it take for hunters to stop moving? It is a deceptively simple question, yet one that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. For most of our long existence, we humans carried our homes on our backs. We were wanderers, following the herds, collecting wild plants, living lightly across wide territories. But at some point in the deep past, something shifted. Groups that had once walked the endless steppe began to stay, to settle, to build places that endured beyond a single lifetime. What force was strong enough to persuade people to give up mobility, the very strategy that had kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer, as far as we can tell, begins in a time of chaos. Around 10,800 years before the Common Era, the climate lurched into another cold spell. After millennia of slow warming, glaciers advanced once more, and much of the northern hemisphere became dry and harsh. This was the Younger Dryas, a brief return of Ice Age conditions that lasted for more than 1,000 years. In Europe, tundra spread back into valleys that had been turning green. In North America, glaciers held firm. And across the Near East, where our story takes place, the lands that had been lush with wild grasses grew thinner and less predictable. For the people of the Natufian culture, who had thrived in the Levant for centuries, this sudden shift was devastating. They had been experimenting with a different kind of life, a life less nomadic, gathering wild cereals and hunting gazelle, while beginning to build more permanent houses. But when the cold and dryness returned, those grasses dwindled, and the gazelle herds shifted away. Many Natufian communities could no longer rely on their semi-sedentary ways. Archaeological layers show villages abandoned, houses left empty, grinding stones unused. Families became mobile again, carrying baskets and tools across the landscape, hunting where they could, retreating into the older rhythms of a forager's life. It is humbling to realize that even as humans experimented with change, climate was still the master. Yet the Younger Dryas was not permanent. Around 9,600 years before the Common Era, the cold broke. Temperatures rose abruptly, rainfall increased, and the Earth entered the long stable warmth of the Holocene, the epoch we still live in today. It was this stability, this rare pause in the chaos of ice and drought, that opened the door to something new. With warmer and wetter conditions, the plants and animals of the Near East flourished. Wild barley, wheat and lentils spread again across the valleys. Oak and pistachio forests thickened. Streams ran year-round in places that had been dry. The world became, if not predictable, then at least a little more forgiving. This is the context in which people began to stay. In the Jordan Valley, by the shores of what is now the Sea of Galilee, a small site known as Archaeology offers us one of the earliest glimpses. Here, even before the Younger Dryas, people had built simple brush huts and ground seeds on stone mortars. Microscopic analysis of the charred remains shows that as early as 23,000 years ago, humans were already experimenting with collecting and processing cereals. They were not farmers yet, but they were clearly learning how to manage plant resources in new ways. It is here that we find hints of bread-like foods and even traces of early fermentation. The people of Archaeology were already laying the groundwork for something that would only become visible many millennia later. By the time the Younger Dryas ended, this knowledge had not disappeared. Instead, it waited in cultural memory. The Natufians and their descendants already knew which plants produced the most grain, which landscapes offered the richest returns, which stones worked best for grinding and cutting. When the environment became favourable again, they were ready to pick up where they had left off. And so, across the Levant and northern Syria, new settlements appeared. Unlike the small clusters of the Natufians, these were larger, denser and more permanent. Archaeologists call this period the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, and in its earlier centuries we see the first hints of what might be called villages. The houses of this time are striking. Built in clusters, they were often circular or oval, their walls made of stone or mud brick, their roofs supported by posts and covered in reeds. Some were rebuilt again and again on the same spot, suggesting that families returned season after season, perhaps year after year. Storage pits cut into the floors suggest that people planned for the future, storing grain and nuts. This is an extraordinary step. For most of our past, food had to be eaten quickly or carried on the move. But to bury food in the earth, trusting that it would be there months later, implies not just technical skill, but a new kind of thinking. It is, in a sense, the beginning of memory tied to place. We can see it too in the way settlements grew. Sites such as Jericho in the Jordan Valley expanded rapidly. Here, archaeologists have uncovered not just circular houses, but also monumental architecture, a massive stone wall and a tower more than 8 meters high, built around 8,000 years before the Common Era. The wall is sometimes interpreted as defence, but more likely it was a flood barrier against seasonal waters. Whatever its purpose, its scale tells us that these people had begun to organise labour, to build together, to create something larger than a single household. It is tempting to look back and see inevitability, as if humans were destined to settle, destined to become farmers. But nothing in the evidence suggests inevitability. Many groups around the world continue to thrive as hunter-gatherers, perfectly adapted to their landscapes. The changes in the Near East seem instead to have been local responses to local opportunities, a stable climate, abundant plants, and perhaps rising populations. Why did people choose to stay rather than keep moving? The answers are still debated. Some suggest that abundance allowed people to experiment, while others argue that population pressure forced them to intensify their use of resources. In truth, it may have been a mixture of both. What we can say is that in these centuries between 10,800 and 8,800 years before the Common Era, a profound shift began. People who had once seen the landscape as something to move across now began to see it as something to anchor themselves to. The house became more than shelter. It became a container of life, death, and memory. The community became more than a band. It became a settlement, with shared walls, shared labour, and perhaps shared identity. The ground itself became layered with generations of use, each building leaving traces beneath the next. And so, we return to the question, what does it take for hunters to stop moving? The answer, as far as the evidence shows, was not a single invention or discovery. It was not the sudden planting of seeds or the domestication of animals. It was the combination of climate stability, cultural memory, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about plants and animals that allowed people to risk staying. It was also, perhaps, the deep human desire to remember, to come back to the same place as season after season, and to see the traces of those who had come before, to build upon them rather than move on. This is only the beginning of the story. The settlements of the pre-pottery Neolithic A were still fragile, still closer to hunting and gathering than to farming, but they mark the first steps toward a way of life that would change everything. The people who built them could not have known that their decision to stay would set humanity on the path toward villages, towns, and eventually cities. They only knew that in a world finally warmed after centuries of cold, they could stop for a while, build a house, and perhaps, for the first time, call it home. What will happen next, when these fragile villages grow larger and face new challenges? What happens when the memory of place begins to outweigh the freedom of movement? These are the questions that carry us forward into the heart of the Neolithic. What does it take for hunters to stop moving? It is a deceptively simple question, yet one that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. For most of our long existence, we humans carried our homes on our backs. We were wanderers, following the herds, collecting wild plants, living lightly across wide territories. But at some point in the deep past, something shifted. Groups that had once walked the endless steppe began to stay, to settle, to build places that endured beyond a single lifetime. What force was strong enough to persuade people to give up mobility, the very strategy that had kept us alive for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer, as far as we can tell, begins in a time of chaos. Around 10,800 years before the Common Era, the climate lurched into another cold spell. After millennia of slow warming, glaciers advanced once more, and much of the northern hemisphere became dry and harsh. This was the Younger Dryas, a brief return of Ice Age conditions that lasted for more than 1,000 years. In Europe, tundra spread back into valleys that had been turning green. In North America, glaciers held firm. And across the Near East, where our story takes place, the lands that had been lush with wild grasses grew thinner and less predictable. For the people of the Natufian culture, who had thrived in the Levant for centuries, this sudden shift was devastating. They had been experimenting with a different kind of life, a life less nomadic, gathering wild cereals and hunting gazelle while beginning to build more permanent houses. But when the cold and dryness returned, those grasses dwindled and the gazelle herds shifted away. Many Natufian communities could no longer rely on their semi-sedentary ways. Archaeological layers show villages abandoned, houses left empty, grinding stones unused. Families became mobile again, carrying baskets and tools across the landscape, hunting where they could, retreating into the older rhythms of a forager's life. It is humbling to realize that even as humans experimented with change, climate was still the master. Yet the Younger Dryas was not permanent. Around 9,600 years before the Common Era, the cold broke. Temperatures rose abruptly, rainfall increased, and the Earth entered the long stable warmth of the Holocene, the epoch we still live in today. It was this stability, this rare pause in the chaos of ice and drought, that opened the door to something new. With warmer and wetter conditions, the plants and animals of the Near East flourished. Wild barley, wheat, and lentils spread again across the valleys. Oak and pistachio forests thickened. Streams ran year-round in places that had been dry. The world became, if not predictable, then at least a little more forgiving. This is the context in which people began to stay. In the Jordan Valley, by the shores of what is now the Sea of Galilee, a small site known as Ohalo II offers us one of the earliest glimpses. Here, even before the Younger Dryas, people had built simple brush huts and ground seeds on stone mortars. Microscopic analysis of the charred remains shows that as early as 23,000 years ago, humans were already experimenting with collecting and processing cereals. They were not farmers yet, but they were clearly learning how to manage plant resources in new ways. It is here that we find hints of bread-like foods and even traces of early fermentation. The people of Ohalo II were already laying the groundwork for something that would only become visible many millennia later. By the time the Younger Dryas ended, this knowledge had not disappeared. Instead, it waited in cultural memory. The Natufians and their descendants already knew which plants produced the most grain, which landscapes offered the richest returns, which stones worked best for grinding and cutting. When the environment became favourable again, they were ready to pick up where they had left off. And so, across the Levant and northern Syria, new settlements appeared. Unlike the small clusters of the Natufians, these were larger, denser, and more permanent. Archaeologists call this period the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, and in its earlier centuries we see the first hints of what might be called villages. What is intriguing is how these early villages balance continuity and change. On the one hand, the circular house remained the dominant form. This shape, familiar from much earlier campsites, may have had practical advantages in roof construction, or perhaps symbolic associations with hearth and home. On the other hand, there were already experiments with rectangular structures. At Muribet, some later levels show the first rectangular rooms, foreshadowing a major architectural transformation. A rectangle can be extended, divided, and joined in ways a circle cannot. Rectilinear plans would eventually allow houses to be packed more densely, and would become the hallmark of later Neolithic towns. But in this earlier era, the transition was only beginning, and the landscape was still dominated by round houses that echoed the past. in these villages we also see hints of new social dynamics. The investment in plaster floors, rebuilt again and again, suggests a concern with appearance, perhaps cleanliness, perhaps tradition. The clustering of houses implies cooperation and negotiation over space. Communal buildings, though rare, hint at gatherings beyond the family. These are subtle clues, but they point to an important development. The household was no longer the only unit of society. People were beginning to identify with a larger whole, to act together in ways that went beyond kinship. Yet we must be careful. These were not yet cities, and to imagine them as proto-cities risks imposing too much of our own expectations. Populations were small, in the low hundreds, and daily life was still dominated by hunting and gathering, with only a partial reliance on cultivated plants. There were no marketplaces, no streets, no palaces or temples. These were villages, plain and simple. But they were villages unlike anything that had existed before. They were permanent, stable, and in their modest way, they were the seeds from which cities would one day grow. Archaeologists often debate why people made this leap. Was it population pressure? Was it the lure of abundant resources in the fertile valleys? Was it simply cultural momentum, the desire to continue the experiments begun by the Natufians centuries earlier? The truth is likely complex. We know that climate stability after the Younger Dryas provided a favourable backdrop. We know that knowledge of plant resources had accumulated for millennia. We know that social traditions valued continuity and return to place. Together, these factors created the conditions for settlement. But we cannot point to a single reason. As so often in history, change was the product of many small choices layered together. What we can observe is the pattern. Across the Levant and northern Syria, in the centuries after 8,800 years before the Common Era, villages multiplied. Each was small, each was modest, yet together they marked a profound transformation. Humanity was beginning to root itself in place, to commit to the land, to build homes that would outlast the people who lived in them. This was not yet civilization. It was not yet urban life. But it was the first step in that long trajectory, the first moment when a cluster of huts became something more. And so the question lingers, when does a cluster of huts become a village? Is it when the walls are plastered smooth, when the floors are rebuilt, when the houses stand shoulder to shoulder? Is it when a few hundred people decide not to move on, to bury their memories in the soil, to stay? We do not know the precise threshold, but somewhere in these centuries the line was crossed. Humanity had discovered the village, and once discovered it would never be forgotten. Why paint your home white again and again? It may sound like a strange thing to ask of people living almost 11,000 years ago, long before the rise of cities, writing, or even pottery. Yet across the villages of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, from the Jordan Valley to northern Syria, archaeologists find the same quiet ritual repeated hundreds of times. Walls and floors coated in a bright smooth plaster, renewed again and again until the layers piled up like the rings of a tree. It was an astonishing innovation, one that required technical skill, immense labour, and perhaps a sense of symbolism that we're only beginning to understand. The story of white plaster begins with fire. Not the kind of fire that warms a hearth or cooks a meal, but fire directed deliberately at stone itself. Limestone, abundant across the Levant and Anatolia, is made of calcium carbonate. When heated to temperatures approaching 900 degrees Celsius, it undergoes a transformation. The rock decomposes, releasing carbon dioxide, and what remains is quicklime, a caustic powder of calcium oxide. If that powder is then mixed with water, it reacts violently, generating heat and forming calcium hydroxide. Spread on walls or floors, this paste dries and hardens into a smooth, durable surface, lime plaster. This was no simple discovery. To achieve such high temperatures, people had to construct large fires, carefully feeding them with wood or brush. They had to understand that not all stone would do, and that limestone had unique properties. They had to master the dangerous process of slaking quicklime with water, which releases heat strong enough to scald the skin, and they had to apply the resulting paste before it hardened, smoothing it into place with hands or tools. In short, lime plaster was a technological breakthrough. It was in a sense the first synthetic building material, made not by nature but by deliberate human chemistry. At Jericho, at Muribet, at Tel Aswad, and at other sites of this period, archaeologists have found houses whose floors were coated with this plaster. In many cases, the plaster was renewed again and again. At Jericho, some floors were resurfaced more than 10 times. At Ain Ghazal in later centuries, walls as well as floors were replastered dozens of times. Each new coat created a thin white surface, hiding whatever lay beneath, making the room bright and clean. Over time, the layers accumulated until the floors became thick cakes of plaster, polished by countless feet. Why did people do this? From a practical standpoint, plaster made sense. It sealed the floor against moisture, it made cleaning easier, and it gave the house a finished appearance. It was more durable than bare earth, less prone to dust and insects. It might even have helped to regulate temperature and humidity. Yet the sheer effort required, burning tons of limestone, hauling wood, mixing and applying paste, suggests that more than practicality was at work. The repeated renewal of plaster has the feel of ritual. It was not enough to build a house once. The house had to be remade again and again, its surface refreshed, as if its life needed to be renewed alongside the lives of those who dwelled within it. Some archaeologists have suggested that the whiteness of plaster carried symbolic weight. White surfaces may have evoked purity, renewal, or even the bones of ancestors. In later cultures across the Near East, white was associated with ritual spaces, with memory, with the liminal realm between life and death. It is tempting to see these early white floors as part of the same tradition. Every time a family resurfaced its house, they were not only repairing it, but reaffirming its place within a cycle of life, death, and renewal. At Muribet, floors and benches of plaster were sometimes painted with red pigment, adding another layer of symbolism. Red ochre had long been used in burials and body decoration, stretching back into the Paleolithic. To place red upon white may have been a way of uniting two powerful symbols: blood and bone, life and memory. The house itself became a canvas upon which the rhythms of existence were written. The technology of plaster also reveals something about community organisation. Producing lime required not just knowledge but cooperation. Limestone had to be quarried, fires had to be built and maintained, wood had to be gathered in large quantities. It is hard to imagine a single household doing all this alone. More likely, plaster production was a communal task, with multiple families contributing labour. In this way, the renewal of floors may have been as much a social event as a technical one. We cannot know exactly what people thought as they spread the white paste across their walls. Did they talk and laugh as they worked, or did they move in solemn silence? Was it a chore, a duty, or a ritual? The evidence does not speak in such detail. What it does show is persistence. Layer after layer, year after year, the surfaces were remade. The effort itself was meaning. To live in these villages was to accept that houses were not static but living things, in need of renewal, just as the people inside were in need of food, fire, and community. There is also a deeper implication. When people replastered their homes, they buried the past beneath a new surface. Old stains, cracks, and marks disappeared under fresh white layers. This act of covering over may have carried psychological weight. It allowed families to erase the traces of time, to begin anew, to present their house as fresh even as the years piled up beneath. In this sense, plastering was a way of controlling memory, of deciding what to keep visible and what to hide. Beneath the bright surfaces, the hidden layers accumulated like a secret history, a silent archive of lives lived. And yet, as archaeologists peel back those layers today, we can still read that archive. Each coat of plaster tells us that people chose to stay, to invest, to maintain. Each renewal tells us that permanence mattered. These were no longer temporary shelters. They were places of return, places that accumulated history. They were, in a real sense, the first architecture of memory. So why paint your home white again and again? Perhaps because in doing so, you declare that your home will endure. Perhaps because you link yourself to a cycle of renewal larger than your own life. Perhaps because whiteness itself carried meaning, reminding you of bone, of purity, of the continuity of generations. Or perhaps, in the end, it was simply what people did, a tradition repeated until it became natural, unquestioned. We may never know for certain. But what we can say is that in those centuries between 8,800 and 8,500 years before the Common Era, across the Near East, villagers transformed their houses with fire and stone. They invented plaster, they renewed their walls, and in doing so they took another step away from the world of tents and camps into the world of villages that endured. The fire below made the white walls above, and those walls in turn shaped how people saw their homes, their lives, and their place in time. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: beneath every bright new surface lay the remains of the old, hidden but never gone. Just as we today walk over ruins without knowing, so too did the people of the Neolithic live above their own pasts, burying them in white and beginning again. Did wheat domesticate us, or did we domesticate it? This is one of those questions that sounds playful at first, but the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. When we look at the long history of the Near East between 9,000 and 8,500 years before the Common Era, we do not see a sudden invention of farming. Instead, we see a drawn-out experiment, a back-and-forth process between people and plants that unfolded over many centuries, and at times it feels less like humans were in control than that we were being nudged step by step into a relationship that would reshape both species forever. The clues begin long before the period we are focusing on. At Çatalhöyük, a lakeside camp in the Jordan Valley dating back 23,000 years, charred remains of cereals have been found alongside grinding stones and hearths. The grains show signs of deliberate harvesting, and the flatbreads preserved in the ashes are the earliest known evidence of bread making. These hunter-gatherers were not yet farmers, but they already knew which plants were worth collecting and how to process them into food. The knowledge lay dormant through the millennia, waiting for the right ecological moment to bloom. That moment came when the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene climate stabilized. With warmer, wetter conditions, wild cereals such as barley and wheat spread again across the valleys and hills. The people who lived there had inherited thousands of years of plant knowledge. They knew how to cut cereals with flint sickles, how to grind them on stone querns, how to store them in pits. At Jerf el Ahmar, a site in northern Syria dated to about 9,300 years before the Common Era, archaeologists have uncovered large communal buildings filled with grinding stones. These were not the tools of a single household. They were large-scale facilities for processing grain, suggesting that people were collecting cereals in bulk. Yet the plants at this time were still wild. The ears shattered easily when ripe, scattering seeds across the ground, making them frustrating to harvest. What happened next was not a deliberate act of invention, but a gradual shift driven by human preference. Wild cereals shed their seeds naturally. The spikelets fall apart to ensure dispersal. But when humans cut the ears with sickles and carried them home, they unconsciously favoured plants whose seeds stayed attached longer. These tougher ears were easier to harvest and transport. When people replanted or discarded leftover grains near their settlements, the varieties that survived were precisely those with non-shattering ears. Over centuries, this small bias changed the genetic balance of the crops. The wheat and barley that grew around villages became subtly different from those in the wild. By 8,700 years before the Common Era, archaeobotanical evidence shows that more than 90% of wheat grains at some sites carried the traits of domestication. The earliest cereals to undergo this process were einkorn and emmer wheat. Einkorn, a diploid species with a simple genome, was domesticated first in the foothills of southern Turkey. Emmer, a tetraploid hybrid of wild einkorn and another grass, followed soon after, becoming one of the staples of the early agriculture. Alongside them, barley was domesticated in both the Levant and Mesopotamia, providing another versatile cereal. Each of these crops had advantages. Einkorn was hardy and nutritious, emmer was high-yielding, and barley could tolerate a wide range of soils. Together they created a diversified base for human subsistence. But cereals were not the only plants drawn into this new relationship. Legumes such as chickpeas, lentils and peas were also being collected and slowly domesticated during this time. The appeal of legumes was not just variety in diet, but their ability to fix nitrogen in the soil, replenishing fertility. People may not have understood the chemistry, but they recognized that fields sown with pulses remained productive longer. Archaeological finds from sites across Syria and Jordan show charred remains of these legumes in early farming contexts. Just as with cereals, the domesticated varieties were selected gradually. Larger seeds, thinner coats, shorter dormancy. Each change made them more dependent on human cultivation, and humans more dependent on them in return. Cyprus offers another piece of the puzzle. Around 10,600 years ago, settlers crossed the Mediterranean and established communities on the island. Excavations at sites like Kyrokitia and Shilurikambos reveal that they brought with them domesticated cereals, along with other plants and animals. This tells us that by this early date, farming was not only being practiced but was also portable. The experiment with plants had become stable enough that people could transplant it to new lands, carrying seeds across the sea to start cultivation in foreign soil. It is important to remember that this process was slow. The difference between wild and domesticated cereals is visible under a microscope, but would not have been obvious to those harvesting them year by year. People did not wake up one morning and decide to plant fields of tame wheat. They simply noticed that some plants were easier to harvest, yielded larger grains, or tasted better, and they kept using them. Over generations, these preferences accumulated until the plants themselves were transformed. And here is where the unsettling thought returns. If humans selected plants, plants also selected humans. By rewarding those who stayed in one place and harvested their seeds, cereals encouraged sedentism. People who relied on them became tied to fields and seasons. Populations grew as porridge and bread provided calories for children. In a sense, wheat and barley shaped us as much as we shaped them. Did we domesticate wheat, or did wheat domesticate us? The answer may be both. There are other mysteries still unresolved. Why these plants and not others? The Fertile Crescent was home to many edible species, yet only a handful became staples. Perhaps it was chance, perhaps practicality, perhaps cultural preference. Why did domestication proceed more quickly in some areas than others? Some communities remained foragers for millennia longer, even in similar environments. And how did knowledge spread? Was it carried by migrating families, or by exchange networks of seeds and tools? Archaeology gives us fragments, but the full story remains incomplete. What we do know is that by 8,500 years before the Common Era, the landscape of the Near East was changing. Fields of domesticated cereals were taking root around villages. Storage pits and silos held surplus grain. Diets shifted toward bread and gruel, supplemented by legumes. Populations expanded as food supplies became more predictable. The long experiment in plants had succeeded, though it was less a conscious success than an accidental entanglement. So did wheat domesticate us, or did we domesticate it? Perhaps the question itself misses the point. Domestication was not a one-sided act, but a relationship, a co-evolution between people and plants. We chose them, and they chose us. Together we created a new way of life, one that tied us to fields, to villages, and eventually to cities. And once that relationship was established, there was no going back. The haunting thought is that in every loaf of bread, in every field of barley swaying in the wind, we still live with the outcome of that ancient experiment. We carry it in our diets, in our bodies, in the very structure of our societies. What began as a simple preference for grains that held together became the foundation of civilization itself. Why do some animals tolerate us and others refuse? It is an odd way to think about domestication, yet it captures the reality of the Neolithic experiment in animals. In the centuries between 8,500 and 8,000 years before the Common Era, people across the Near East began to forge closer ties with certain wild species. This was not yet farming in the modern sense, but rather a slow shift in relationships, from hunters stalking gazelle across the plains to herders keeping goats in pens near their homes. Some animals allowed this relationship to take shape. Others resisted so stubbornly that they were left behind. The story of why sheep and goats joined us while gazelles and deer slipped away is as much about biology and behaviour as it is about human ingenuity. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first species to come under human management were goats. Wild Bezoar goats roamed the rocky hills of the Zagros and Taurus mountains, browsing shrubs and climbing cliffs with astonishing agility. Around 8,500 years before the Common Era, sites in southeastern Anatolia such as Çatalhöyük and in the Zagros such as Ganj Dare show signs that goats were being selectively managed. The bones tell the story. Age and sex profiles of goat remains at these sites reveal that young males were being killed in disproportionate numbers, while females were allowed to live longer. This pattern does not match natural hunting, where kills tend to reflect whatever animals could be caught. Instead, it reflects human control, culling juvenile males while keeping breeding females alive. It is the hallmark of herding. Sheep followed a similar trajectory. The wild mouflons of the Fertile Crescent were herd animals, already accustomed to group living and relatively tolerant of human presence. Like goats, they could survive on marginal pastures, turning scrub and grass into meat and milk. Their herding instinct made them easy to control in groups, and by 8,000 years before the Common Era, their bones too show signs of human management. Reduced horn size, smaller body proportions, and shifted age profiles all point to domestication underway. Sheep, once wild on the Anatolian steppes, had entered into a partnership with humanity that would endure for millennia. Why sheep and goats? Their biology made them suitable candidates. They breed quickly, their young imprint on caretakers, and they are flexible in diet. They do not require elaborate enclosures, and their social nature allows them to be led and corralled. Most importantly, they provide multiple resources: meat, milk, hides, and eventually wool. It is easy to see why early communities invested in managing them. They were, in a sense, cooperative partners. Contrast this with gazelle, the mainstay of Natufian hunters just centuries before. Gazelles were abundant, fast, and tasty, but they resisted domestication. Their nervous temperament made them panic in enclosures. Their reproductive biology was poorly suited to confinement, with low birth rates and high mortality in captivity. Attempts to keep them likely ended in frustration. Archaeological evidence shows that even as settlements grew, gazelle bones remained common in refuse heaps. People kept hunting them for centuries, but they never became livestock. They were too wild to stay. The same holds for red deer and fallow deer. These animals were hunted extensively, their antlers prized for tools and ornaments, their meat a valued source of food. Yet they too refused domestication. Their migratory habits and solitary temperaments made them unsuitable for close management. Even when captured, they remained dangerous and difficult to breed in captivity. While sheep and goats slowly transformed into docile herd animals, deer remained on the other side of the human-animal boundary, always hunted but never tamed. Pigs present a more complex story. Wild boar were widespread across the Near East, rooting in forests and river valleys. They were prolific breeders, capable of producing large litters, and their diet was omnivorous, overlapping with human food waste. At sites such as Çatalhöyük, evidence suggests that pigs were being managed by 8,000 years before the Common Era. Bones show reduced body size, a trait associated with domestication, and kill patterns again suggest selective culling. Yet pigs were not as widely adopted as sheep and goats, perhaps because they competed directly with humans for food, and were harder to herd in open landscapes. They were useful, but not always easy to manage. Cattle were another story altogether. The wild aurochs of the Neolithic Near East were massive creatures, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with sweeping horns and unpredictable temperaments. Hunting them was perilous but rewarding. Domestication was slower to come. Early signs of managed aurochs appear later, in the centuries after 8,000 years before the Common Era, in Anatolia and northern Syria. Bones show gradual reductions in size and changes in horn shape. But the process was arduous. Aurochs were dangerous, their strength immense, and only through generations of selective breeding and confinement did they eventually become the cattle that powered agriculture. At this early stage, they were still on the edge of domestication, a reminder of how difficult some species were to draw into human society. How did people manage these early herds? Archaeological traces suggest a variety of strategies. At Çatalhöyük, for instance, enclosures have been found that may have served as pens. Animal dung layers, trampled into floors, hint at corralling. At Çatalhöyük, substructures beneath houses contain bones that suggest storage and slaughtering areas. More broadly, the pattern of kill-off ages indicates that people were not simply hunting herds in the wild, but controlling their reproduction. By culling young males, communities ensured a sustainable breeding population of females, securing a steady supply of meat without exhausting the herd. It was a simple but effective management system. This process was not sudden. It unfolded gradually, with overlapping phases of hunting and herding. For centuries, settlements show mixtures of wild and domestic animals. People did not abandon hunting overnight. They supplemented it with management. But over time, the balance shifted. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, in many communities, sheep and goats were becoming primary sources of meat. The hunting of gazelle and deer declined. Human diets were changing, and with them human relationships to the landscape. There are still many mysteries. How exactly did people capture the first goats and sheep? Did they round up newborns and raise them near camp? Did they follow herds and slowly accustom them to human presence? Did they build pens or use natural cliffs and valleys to trap them? Archaeology offers hints but no firm answers. What we see are the results: bones with age profiles, dung in floors, reduced horn cores. The process itself remains in shadow. And then there is the larger question. Why these species and not others? Why did sheep, goats, pigs, and eventually cattle become livestock, while gazelle, deer, onager, and many birds remained wild? Biologists point to criteria of domesticability: flexible diet, fast growth, docile temperament, breeding in captivity, and social structure amenable to herding. Only a few species meet these criteria. Jared Diamond famously noted that of the many thousands of animal species on Earth, only about a dozen large mammals have ever been domesticated. In the Near East, the ones that cooperated were sheep and goats, and later pigs and cattle. The rest resisted, and humanity moved on. The impact of this transition cannot be overstated. Domesticated herds provided more than meat. They supplied milk, hides, bones, sinew, and later wool. They could be slaughtered in controlled ways, stored on the hoof as living reserves. They tethered people more tightly to place, as herds required grazing land, water, and protection. They also introduced new risks: disease transmission, overgrazing, conflict over pasture. But for better or worse, they became part of human society. So why do some animals tolerate us and others refuse? Perhaps the answer is that tolerance is mutual. Humans tolerated the stubbornness of goats, the unpredictability of pigs, the danger of aurochs, because the rewards were worth it. Sheep and goats tolerated the proximity of humans because it provided them protection, food, and reproductive opportunity. Gazelle and deer, by contrast, neither gave nor received enough to make the relationship last. In the end, domestication was not a conquest, but a partnership, fragile and contingent. And the haunting thought is that this partnership reshaped not only the animals, but us as well. Our diets, our settlements, our labour, even our diseases were transformed by the herds that stayed. We still live with the consequences today. In every flock of sheep on a hillside, in every cow in a pasture, in every goat that still tests the patience of its herder. The experiment of 8.5 millennia ago continues, its results woven into our daily lives. If farming broke our backs and rotted our teeth, why did we keep at it? That question sits at the heart of the Neolithic story, and it is not just a dramatic flourish. Archaeological evidence paints a sobering picture of what happened when human communities across the Near East leaned fully into sedentary farming life between 8,500 and 7,500 years before the Common Era. By most measures of health, early farmers seem worse off than the hunter-gatherers who came before them, and yet this terrible idea became the dominant human strategy for survival, reshaping the species in ways from which there was no turning back. The evidence begins with the bones. When skeletal remains of early farmers are compared with those of preceding hunter-gatherers, the differences are striking. For one, early farmers are shorter on average. In many sites, adult males and females lost several centimetres of stature compared to their Natufian or Paleolithic ancestors. Height is not everything, but it is often a marker of overall health and nutrition during childhood. Reduced stature suggests that despite the apparent abundance of grain, diets were actually more limited, more monotonous, and often deficient in key nutrients. Dental remains tell another part of the story. Hunter-gatherers rarely show cavities. Their diets were diverse, consisting of meats, fruits, nuts, and wild plants, with little concentrated starch. By contrast, the jaws of early farmers reveal a surge in dental caries. The grinding of cereals into flour and their cooking into gruels and breads introduced a steady stream of carbohydrates, which bacteria in the mouth readily converted into acid, eroding enamel and forming cavities. Without toothbrushes or dentistry, these infections could be debilitating, even fatal. The skeletons of some early farmers reveal abscesses that must have caused years of pain. Signs of labour are etched into the bones as well. The repetitive strain of grinding grain on heavy stone querns left deep grooves in the joints of elbows and shoulders. Vertebrae show compression from hauling loads and hours bent at awkward angles. Arthritis appears earlier, and more often, than in mobile foraging populations. Farming was relentless physical work. Fields had to be cleared, seeds planted, weeds pulled, harvests gathered, and grain ground into flour. None of this could be done casually or occasionally. Farming demanded day after day of labour, often at the expense of the body itself. Then there is the issue of disease. Sedentary life brought new risks. Villages crowded hundreds of people into tight spaces, often with domesticated animals nearby. Refuse accumulated, water sources became contaminated, and parasites flourished. Archaeological studies of early farming communities reveal higher rates of infection, visible in lesions on bones, and increased childhood mortality. The close proximity of humans and animals also opened the door to zoonotic diseases, pathogens that leapt from one species to another. Many of the infectious diseases that still trouble humanity today, measles, smallpox, influenza, trace their ultimate origins to this Neolithic cohabitation of people and livestock. It is a sobering portrait. Shorter bodies, weaker teeth, aching joints, higher rates of disease. By any individual measure, the foragers who lived before the Neolithic seem healthier, freer, and perhaps even happier. So why did humanity persist with farming once the costs became so clear? The most compelling answer is not about individual health, but about population. Farming may have been bad for individuals, but it was very good for communities. Sedentary life allowed women to bear children at shorter intervals. Among foragers, long breastfeeding suppresses ovulation and limits births to perhaps one every 4 years. Carrying infants while ranging across large territories also constrains family size. In villages with reliable supplies of soft, starchy foods and access to animal milk, children could be weaned earlier. Women could have more pregnancies, and more children survived infancy. The result was a demographic explosion. Archaeologists estimate that in the Levant, population size increased several-fold between 9,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era. Burial sites reveal far more child remains, not because mortality rose, but because there were simply more children being born. Villages grew, houses multiplied, and landscapes filled with people in ways that had never been seen before. This growth created a kind of ratchet effect. Once a community expanded, it could not easily go back to foraging, because the local environment could not sustain so many people on wild resources alone. Farming, however costly, became the only viable way forward. There were also social benefits to farming, though these are harder to measure. Surplus grain could be stored, allowing communities to buffer against lean years. Feasting became more elaborate, strengthening alliances and reinforcing social bonds. People invested in houses and villages that stood for generations, creating a sense of continuity and identity. In some cases, agricultural surpluses allowed a few individuals or households to accumulate prestige, marking the beginnings of inequality. Whether these were advantages or problems depends on perspective, but they were undeniably powerful forces that encouraged the continuation of farming practices. Modern anthropology adds another layer to the story. Studies of contemporary foraging groups often reveal that they can meet their dietary needs with relatively few hours of work per day, sometimes less than 30 hours a week. By comparison, subsistence farmers often labour twice as long. If time and health were the only considerations, foraging seems superior, but farming allows populations to grow far beyond the limits of foraging. In evolutionary terms, reproduction trumps comfort. Groups that farmed had more children, and over time they replaced groups that did not. Farming spread not because it was easier or healthier, but because it allowed more people to exist. Still, we should resist the temptation to frame this as destiny. There was nothing inevitable about farming. Some groups resisted it for centuries, continuing to hunt and gather successfully on the edges of the Fertile Crescent. Even within farming communities, hunting and gathering continued as supplements to diets. The transition was gradual, uneven, and filled with local variation. Farming was not a choice made once for all time, but a set of practices that slowly proved resilient in the face of demographic and environmental pressures. And so we return to the question, if farming broke our backs and rotted our teeth, why did we keep at it? The answer lies not in the health of individuals, but in the survival of groups. Farming allowed more births, more people, more stability in numbers, even if at the cost of more pain. It was a trade-off, and one that locked humanity into a path of labour and disease, but also of expansion and endurance. The haunting thought is that in many ways we're still living with this bargain. Modern diets, dominated by cereals, still leave their marks on our teeth and our health. Modern labour, though mechanised, still carries the rhythms of agriculture. And modern populations, numbering in the billions, are the direct descendants of that first demographic boom. Farming may have been a terrible idea for the body, but it was an extraordinarily successful idea for the species. When villages grow into towns, who moves in and why? This is the puzzle that faces us in the centuries between 8,000 and 7,500 years before the Common Era. By this time, farming had firmly taken root across much of the Near East. Goats and sheep were becoming dependable sources of meat and milk. Fields of einkorn and emmer wheat ripened near settlements, and populations had surged. But farming alone does not explain the dramatic rise of what archaeologists call megasites, villages that swelled far beyond the scale of earlier communities, drawing in thousands of people, while smaller settlements nearby were abandoned. What motivated families to leave their old homes and gather in these larger, denser centres? And what did this shift mean for daily life? The site of An Ghazal in modern Jordan provides one of the clearest examples. Founded along the Zarqa River around 8,000 years before the Common Era, this settlement began modestly, but within a few centuries it ballooned into one of the largest known communities of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic, covering more than 15 hectares and housing perhaps 2,000 people at its peak. Excavations reveal tightly packed rectangular houses, streets or open spaces winding between them, and large communal structures. Surrounding villages shrank or vanished altogether. It seems clear that people were relocating from smaller hamlets into this growing hub. Why? Part of the answer may lie in demographics. Farming supported higher birth rates, but managing growing populations in scattered hamlets may have been difficult. Larger centres offered efficiencies of scale. Food surpluses could be stored and redistributed more effectively. Specialised labour, such as flint knapping or plaster production, could flourish when populations were concentrated. Communal projects, such as large buildings or irrigation works, required critical mass. By gathering in larger numbers, people may have secured stability that smaller settlements could not provide. Further north, in the Euphrates Valley, the story was similar. Abu Huraira had been occupied since the Epi-Paleolithic, making it one of the longest-lived settlements in the region. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, its population swelled into the thousands. Excavations revealed dense architecture, thick with rectangular houses built wall to wall, their plastered floors renewed over and over, grain processing facilities and storage pits multiplied. Animal bones show the transition from hunting gazelle to managing herds of sheep and goats. As with Ain Ghazal, smaller satellite sites dwindled, their inhabitants likely absorbed into the growing settlement. In Anatolia, the story repeated. Çatalhöyük, established near the Melendiz River around 8,200 years before the Common Era, became a bustling centre, home to perhaps a few thousand people. Excavations revealed tightly clustered mud brick houses, each accessed from the roof with shared courtyards and communal ovens. Evidence of large-scale animal management appears here too, particularly with sheep and goats. The density of population is striking. Houses were rebuilt again and again in the same locations, creating stratified layers of occupation. People were no longer just staying put. They were committing to permanence on a scale not seen before. Nearby, at Kayonu in southeastern Turkey, the story was even more dramatic. Founded earlier in the 9th millennium before the Common Era, it continued to grow through the 8th, eventually reaching several hectares in size. Its distinctive grill plan architecture, with stone substructures beneath raised floors, suggests new experiments in building design. Communal buildings stood alongside domestic ones, hinting at complex social organisation. Excavations reveal signs of trade networks, with obsidian from distant Cappadocia and seashells from the Mediterranean appearing among the finds. Azadein Ghazal surrounding smaller villages declined, suggesting that Kayonu drew people in from across the landscape. Why did this pattern emerge almost everywhere at once? Archaeologists debate the reasons, but a few themes recur. One is migration under pressure. As populations grew, some areas may have struggled to sustain themselves. Soil fertility can decline under repeated cultivation, and local hunting grounds may have been depleted. Moving into larger centres with better access to fertile land and water may have been a survival strategy. Another factor may have been security. Larger populations provided protection against conflict, whether from neighbouring groups or from tensions within communities themselves. And there may also have been a social pull. Larger settlements offered opportunities for exchange, ritual, and alliance that smaller hamlets could not. To live in a megasite may have meant access to resources, prestige, and participation in cultural innovations. It is important to note, however, that life in these megasites was not necessarily easy. Crowding brought new problems. Disease transmission would have been greater in dense populations. Waste management and sanitation became pressing issues, with refuse pits and drainage systems required to handle the byproducts of daily life. Agricultural labour intensified, with fields extending further out from the settlement to feed the swelling population. Inequality may also have begun to creep in. Archaeologists at some sites see hints of larger houses or richer burials, though the evidence remains debated. What is clear is that the scale of these communities transformed the rhythms of daily existence. One striking feature of these megasites is their apparent magnetism. They did not simply grow by natural population increase, they drew people in from elsewhere. Excavations show that smaller villages in the vicinity were often abandoned around the same time that larger centres expanded. At Ain Ghazal, for instance, surrounding settlements east of the Jordan dwindled even as the town grew to unprecedented size. This suggests active migration, perhaps driven by necessity, perhaps by choice. The reasons may have varied: food security, opportunities for trade, participation in ritual life. But the pattern is unmistakable. People were consolidating into fewer, larger centres. This raises questions about identity and belonging. In a small village, everyone knows everyone else, and social bonds are woven tightly through kinship. In a settlement of thousands, that intimacy is diluted. How did people navigate such change? Did they form new networks of neighbourhoods, clans, or craft groups? Did communal buildings serve as anchors of shared identity? Did rituals bind strangers together into something like a community? Archaeology can only gesture at these possibilities, but it seems likely that as settlements grew, new forms of social cohesion were required. It is tempting to see in these megasites the first glimmers of urbanism. Thousands of people living together, dense housing, communal architecture, long-distance trade, all the hallmarks of a proto-city. But we must be careful not to project too much. These communities lacked writing, centralised administration, and clear evidence of social stratification. They were not cities in the Mesopotamian sense. They were instead something unique, large-scale villages, experiments in aggregation that would both succeed and fail in their own ways. Why did people move in, and why did they stay? Perhaps because the benefits outweighed the costs. Larger communities offered resilience in numbers, opportunities for exchange, and participation in collective projects. Perhaps because once populations grew, there was no easy way back. Smaller villages could not compete, and their inhabitants joined the centres that remained. Or perhaps because, for the first time in human history, people felt drawn to the idea of living among thousands, to the energy of scale, to the promise of something larger than themselves. The haunting thought is that these early megasites foreshadowed the dilemmas of urban life that still shape us today. Crowding and disease, inequality and cooperation, identity and anonymity, all were already being negotiated 8,000 years ago. The decisions people made then, to gather in large numbers despite the costs, set humanity on the path toward the cities of later millennia. When villages grew into towns, people moved in not because it was easy, but because it was necessary or perhaps inevitable. And once they did, the world would never be the same. Why carve gods into stone if they can fit inside your house? That is the question that hangs over the centuries after the monumental enclosures of Göbekli Tepe had already stood watch on their limestone ridge. Around 9,000 years before the Common Era, Göbekli was the dazzling anomaly of the Pre-Pottery Neolithic. Towering T-shaped pillars carved with foxes, vultures, snakes, and human arms, arranged in great circular sanctuaries. But as the 8th millennium unfolded, the role of such grand pilgrimage centres began to change. Communities no longer invested their energy in building vast shared sanctuaries far from daily life. Instead, they began carving pillars and raising shrines inside their own settlements, bringing the gods and the rituals closer to the hearth. The site of Nevali Chori in southeastern Turkey gives us one of the clearest glimpses of this transition. Nestled on the slopes above the Euphrates, Nevali Chori was founded in the early 8th millennium before the Common Era. Its houses were rectangular, clustered together in dense neighbourhoods, but among them stood a building that was different. Constructed of stone, larger than any domestic structure, and furnished with T-shaped pillars, it bore unmistakable echoes of Göbekli Tepe. These pillars were smaller, and their iconography less elaborate, but the symbolism was familiar. Stylized human arms carved along their sides, loincloths indicated by faint relief, the suggestion that these were anthropomorphic beings. The building's fired lime floor mirrored the polished plaster surfaces of Göbekli's great enclosures. It was, in short, a sanctuary built not on a remote hilltop but within the heart of a village. Çatalhöyük, further east in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, provides another example. Founded earlier in the 9th millennium, Çatalhöyük grew steadily through the 8th, developing distinctive architecture with raised floors supported by stone grille substructures. Among its buildings were several rectangular communal structures that differed markedly from ordinary houses. In one of these, archaeologists discovered 3 stone monoliths set upright in the floor. They were not as tall as the Göbekli pillars, nor were they elaborately carved, but their placement suggests a symbolic function. Nearby, other communal buildings revealed evidence of gatherings, feasting and ritual deposition. Here too the sacred had been brought inside the settlement, woven into the daily fabric of village life. What drove this shift from grand pilgrimage centres to local sanctuaries? Part of the answer may lie in the changing economy. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, farming had taken hold across the region. People were increasingly tied to their fields, their herds and their houses. The nomadic or semi-nomadic patterns that may have supported the construction of remote sanctuaries like Göbekli were fading. Communities no longer gathered seasonally on windswept ridges to carve animal spirits into stone. Instead, they invested in shrines at the heart of their own villages, where ritual could unfold alongside daily life. Another part of the answer may be social. At Göbekli, the scale of construction required coordination among multiple groups, perhaps even whole regions. It was a place that transcended the household or village. But as settlements grew into megasites like Çatalhöyük or Ain Ghazal, new forms of social cohesion were needed within the community itself. Communal ritual building served as anchors for identity, reinforcing bonds among hundreds or thousands of inhabitants who could no longer rely solely on kinship ties. Shrines inside villages allowed ritual to knit together daily life in a way that remote sanctuaries could not. It is important not to see this as decline. The later ritual buildings were smaller, yes, but they were also more integrated. They suggest not a loss of meaning, but a transformation of it. Ritual was no longer something performed in a distant sacred place. It was embedded in the rhythms of home, field, and village. The gods, or whatever beings the pillars represented, no longer dwelled only on hilltops among wild animals. They were invited into houses, into walls, into plastered floors renewed again and again. The architecture itself reflects this domestication of ritual. Göbekli's enclosures were circular, open to the sky, with massive pillars dominating their centres. By contrast, Nevali Chori's shrine was rectangular, roofed, with pillars set against walls as much as in open space. The form had shifted from cosmic openness to enclosed intimacy. The scale had shrunk, but the symbolism persisted. In these pillars we can still glimpse the same tradition of anthropomorphic beings, of the human merging with the divine. Yet now they stood within a village room, accessible to a few dozen rather than to the hundreds who once gathered in Göbekli's circles. At Çatalhöyük, the communal buildings also hint at shifting functions. Some appear to have been used for food processing and feasting, with large hearths and grinding stones. Others show evidence of special deposition of animal bones and human remains. Together they suggest that ritual was becoming bound up with daily sustenance, with this cycle of planting, harvesting, slaughtering and eating. The sacred and the mundane were less distinct. A feast might honour both the ancestors and the community's labour, blending ritual and survival into one. This shift may reflect the broader transition from hunting to farming. At Göbekli, animal iconography dominates. Foxes, boars, vultures and snakes carved in relief, reminders of a world still tied to the hunt. By the time of veneration and Çatalhöyük, the balance had changed. People still hunted, but herding and cultivation were central. The pillars grew smaller, the animal carvings fewer. Ritual turned inward toward ancestors, households, and the cycles of domestic life. The gods no longer stood among wild beasts alone. They stood among walls of mud brick, plaster, and the stored grain of the community. We must be cautious, of course. Interpretation is always speculative. We cannot ask the builders of veneration why they carved arms into their pillars, or the residents of Çatalhöyük why they placed monoliths in their floors. We can only observe patterns, compare sites and suggest possibilities, but the pattern seems clear enough. In the centuries after Göbekli, ritual architecture spread across the Near East, shrinking in scale but multiplying in number, woven into the settlements where people lived and farmed. And this raises the haunting question: what happens when gods no longer live on mountains, but in houses? Does the sacred lose some of its grandeur, or does it gain intimacy? Do people feel less awe, or more closeness? Did the pillars inside veneration inspire the same reverence as the towering stones of Göbekli? Or did they serve a different, quieter role, reminding families of the divine within their walls? We cannot know for certain, but we can see that in this period, humanity was not abandoning ritual. It was transforming it, making it part of daily life. The legacy of these choices would echo for millennia. The shift from remote sanctuaries to village shrines foreshadowed the temples and churches that would one day stand at the centre of towns and cities. The gods would move from hills and caves into the streets of human settlements, becoming permanent neighbours. The seeds of that shift were planted here, in the 8th millennium before the Common Era, when people began carving smaller pillars and raising them inside their own walls. Why carve gods into stone if they can fit inside your house? Perhaps because once people settled into villages, they needed the sacred to settle with them. Perhaps because the rituals that had once been grand seasonal gatherings became daily domestic rhythms. Or perhaps because, like wheat and goats, ritual itself was domesticated, reshaped by the same forces that turned hunters into farmers and wanderers into villagers. The gods stayed because people stayed, and from that moment on neither would ever be the same. Who are the faceless beings on the walls? That is the unsettling question that emerges from the Neolithic Near East, in the centuries between 8,500 and 7,500 years before the Common Era. Across villages that were only just learning how to farm and herd, across landscapes where people lived more densely than ever before, images of human-like figures began to appear. They were sculpted in plaster, carved into pillars, painted onto walls. Some had arms, hands and torsos, but no faces. Some had enormous eyes that seemed to stare beyond death. Others were life-size statues, eerily lifelike but mute, buried in pits as if waiting for us to rediscover them. These were the first beings we might dare to call gods, though we cannot name them, cannot translate the thoughts of the people who made them. We can only piece together the fragments and ask why, at this moment in time, the human imagination took this dramatic turn. The tradition begins with the T-shaped pillars. At Göbekli Tepe, carved centuries before, the pillars were already more than abstract stone. They bore human arms, hands folded across the belly, belts and loincloths transforming stone into anthropomorphic beings. They were human-like, but also more than human, towering above the enclosures like mute presences. When the tradition spread to veneration, the same motifs appeared. pillars with carved arms and faint traces of clothing. The implication is clear enough. These stones were not just supports. They embodied beings, perhaps ancestors, perhaps spirits, perhaps deities, though we cannot say which. But in the villages of the 8th millennium the imagery diversified. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, archaeologists uncovered one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the Neolithic world: dozens of plaster statues buried in 2 large pits. Standing up to a metre in height, these figures were made over reed cores, layered with plaster, then painted. Some were full-bodied, with torsos, legs and arms. Others were busts with 1 or 2 heads. All bore stylized features: almond-shaped eyes outlined in bitumen, traces of hair or headdresses, faint decorations suggesting clothing. Yet what is most striking is their lack of mouths. The faces stare out silently, their eyes wide, their lips absent. Whatever these beings represented, they did not speak. The statues were not displayed in homes but deliberately buried. At Ain Ghazal they were placed together in groups, carefully laid down and covered. They were not casual creations nor toys. The labour required to make them was immense, from quarrying limestone to burn into plaster, to sculpting delicate features. Their burial suggests ritual purpose, perhaps offerings to deities, perhaps embodiments of ancestors, perhaps both. Their silence may have been deliberate, their muteness a reminder that the realm they came from was beyond words. Elsewhere we see similar imagery, though on smaller scales. At Jericho, fragments of plaster figures have been uncovered, echoing the larger statues of Ain Ghazal. At Tel Aswad, busts with painted eyes have been found, suggesting that the tradition was widespread across the Levant. In each case, the pattern is the same: human-like figures, rendered in plaster, with exaggerated eyes and minimal mouths, carefully buried rather than discarded. It seems communities across the region were engaging in a shared symbolic practice, though each interpreted it locally. On the walls of houses, too, enigmatic figures appear. At Çatalhöyük and Çatalhöyük, wall reliefs show upturned arms, circular markings on torsos, and stylized limbs. At times, these figures resemble bears or other animals, blurring the line between human and beast. At other times, they seem entirely abstract, a grammar of symbols whose meaning we cannot decode. Yet their placement in prominent positions, on walls, in communal buildings, near hearths, suggests they were central to ritual life. What did these faceless beings mean to those who made them? The most common interpretation is that they represent ancestors. As communities became more sedentary, buried their dead beneath floors, and lived for generations in the same houses, the presence of ancestors would have loomed large. To sculpt a figure with staring eyes may have been to give form to the memory of the dead, to keep them present in plaster even as their bones lay hidden below. Another interpretation is that they were deities, gods whose names are lost, whose forms were still fluid, half human and half abstract. If so, these are among the earliest depictions of divine beings in human history. It is also possible that they were both ancestor and deity, that the boundary between the two was not as sharp as we might imagine. In many later traditions, ancestors become deified, their memory and their power merging with the divine. Perhaps in the 8th millennium before the Common Era, people were beginning to experiment with this idea, turning memory into gods, and gods into plaster forms. The focus on eyes is particularly intriguing. At Ain Ghazal, the eyes were carefully painted, outlined in black, often disproportionately large. At Jericho and Tel Aswad too, eyes dominate what remains. Why eyes? Perhaps because eyes are the essence of recognition, the point of contact between living and dead, human and divine. To stare into eyes is to confront presence. In making eyes the dominant feature, Neolithic people may have been emphasizing the enduring gaze of ancestors or gods, always watching, always present, even if silent. The muteness of these figures is equally haunting. The absence of mouths may symbolize silence or death, or the idea that the beings they represented communicated beyond speech. It may also remind us that these were not portraits in the modern sense. They were symbolic beings, abstractions of power and memory, not literal depictions. Their lack of speech was part of their otherness. It is tempting to see in these faceless beings the birth of religion as we might recognize it. A pantheon of gods, a set of rituals, a visual language of the sacred. But we should be cautious. These figures may not have been gods in any sense familiar to us. They may have been ancestors, spirits, symbolic representations of community, or something else entirely. What we can say is that people felt the need to embody such beings physically, to give them form in plaster and paint, to bring them into houses and then carefully into them. That impulse itself is extraordinary. Why then, at this particular moment in history, did humans begin to make gods, or ancestors or spirits, visible in this way? One answer lies in the new scale of society. In small foraging bands, ritual and memory could be carried by oral tradition and personal relationships. In villages of thousands, new symbols were needed to bind people together, to anchor collective identity. Statues and wall reliefs provided tangible focal points for ritual and memory. They made the invisible visible, the intangible tangible. Another answer may lie in the changing relationship with death. As populations grew and burials multiplied beneath floors, the presence of the dead became more pressing. Statues may have offered a way to manage that presence, to give it form and ritual structure. Rather than being overwhelmed by the memory of countless individuals, communities could focus on abstract beings, faceless yet present, embodying the collective dead or the powers beyond. The haunting question remains: who were these beings? Were they gods, ancestors, spirits, or some fusion of all three? We cannot name them, and perhaps that is the point. Their very facelessness, their silence, their burial in the earth, suggest that they were meant to be beyond the reach of names. They were presences, not persons, reminders of a world just beyond sight, always there, always watching. And so the first gods we can't name linger still, in the broken statues of Ain Ghazal, in the carved arms of Navali Chori's pillars, in the painted eyes on plaster walls. They remind us that even at the dawn of farming villages, people sought to give shape to what lay beyond, to embody memory, power and presence in forms both human and other. We cannot name them, but we can still see them, and perhaps that is enough. What happens when a whole city is just one endless roof? That is the riddle of Çatalhöyük, the great settlement that rose on the Konya plain of central Anatolia, around 7,100 years before the Common Era, and persisted until roughly 6,500. To walk into Çatalhöyük, if one could, would not mean strolling along open streets or across plazas. There were no streets at all. Instead, there was a continuous honeycomb of mud brick houses pressed wall against wall, each entered not by a door at ground level, but by a ladder dropped down through the roof. The city was less a network of roads, and more a vast quilt of rooftops stitched together, on which daily life unfolded. To move through it was to move across flat mud surfaces in the sun, hopping from one family's roof to the next. To enter one's home, you did not open a door. You climbed down into a dim plastered room from above. The architecture of Çatalhöyük is perhaps its most striking feature. Each house was rectangular, typically 1 or 2 rooms, built from sun-dried mud brick and white plastered inside. The main room contained a hearth, oven, and platforms raised along the walls. These platforms served multiple functions: sleeping benches, work surfaces, and eventually burial locations beneath. Side rooms attached to the main chamber acted as storage areas, dark and cramped, filled with bins of grain and other supplies. The houses had no windows, no doors at ground level, only rooftop entrances. Each roof beam was removed when a house was abandoned, the walls collapsed inward, and new structures were built directly atop the old. Over centuries, this process created a mound of occupation more than 20 meters deep, layered with generations of rebuilding. Life inside these houses was dense and repetitive. Families lived in close quarters, cooking, sleeping, storing, and working in the same space. The walls were frequently replastered with white lime, sometimes dozens of times, creating gleaming interiors that contrasted with the mud brick exteriors. Hearths smoked beneath ladders, where light fell from the rooftop opening. The spaces would have been dim and filled with the sounds of daily life, the grinding of grain on querns, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices. Privacy would have been minimal, as walls abutted one another, and sound carried easily across the roofscape. The layering of buildings over time creates a unique archaeological record. Excavators can trace family histories through superimposed houses, one built directly over another, often with similar layouts. It seems families rebuilt on the same plots across generations, reinforcing ties to place, and to ancestors buried beneath the floors. Each new house both preserved and erased the one below, preserved by its foundations, erased by the demolition required to build anew. In this way, Çatalhöyük embodied continuity and renewal, a settlement where memory was literally underfoot. From above, the city must have appeared as a sprawling platform of mud and plaster, punctuated by smoke holes where hearths glowed inside. People walked across this shared surface as if it were a communal street, though technically it was the roof of hundreds of private homes. Daily interaction took place on rooftops, neighbours passing, children playing, families drying crops or working hides in the sun. Yet beneath each roof was an interior world of its own, enclosed, plastered, filled with both the mundane and the sacred. Çatalhöyük was both endless communal roof and endless private chamber, a paradox of togetherness and separation. Why did the inhabitants of Çatalhöyük build in this way? Part of the answer lies in defence. Without streets, there were no easy entry points for outsiders. The settlement presented a continuous wall of mud brick to the outside world, with no gates or openings. Access was strictly controlled by rooftop ladders. Another reason may have been efficiency. With houses pressed so tightly together, land within the settlement was used to maximum capacity, leaving more room for agriculture outside. And perhaps another reason was social. By building houses wall to wall, families signalled solidarity, interdependence, and participation in a community of thousands. Inside, the houses were not only functional, but also symbolic. Many contained wall paintings and reliefs, often of animals such as aurochs, leopards or deer, but also of geometric patterns and abstract shapes. Some walls were studded with animal horns set into plaster, turning domestic spaces into shrines. The boundary between the sacred and the mundane was thin at Çatalhöyük. A family might cook porridge beneath a wall, adorned with bull horns, or sleep beneath a leopard relief. Daily life was never far from ritual presence. The repeated plastering of walls and floors reinforces this sense of symbolism. White plaster was not only practical, sealing mud brick against dust and pests, but also aesthetic, transforming interiors into bright reflective spaces. The effort involved was immense, requiring the burning of limestone to create lime, then the application of multiple layers. Some floors and walls were replastered dozens of times, each layer a renewal. Archaeologists debate whether this constant renewal was primarily hygienic, aesthetic, or ritual, but likely it was all three. In any case, it created an environment where life was lived against a backdrop of constant renewal, of surfaces repeatedly made clean and bright. Çatalhöyük's rooftop city also tells us something about social organisation. Despite its size, perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 inhabitants at its peak, there is little evidence of hierarchy in the architecture. Houses are remarkably uniform, similar in size and layout, with no palaces, temples, or central administrative buildings. If there were leaders, they did not dwell in markedly different structures. Authority seems to have been diffused, expressed perhaps through ritual or lineage rather than through visible monuments. This contrasts with later Mesopotamian cities, where temples and palaces dominated skylines. Çatalhöyük's skyline was flat, unbroken, an endless roofscape. Archaeologists have long debated whether Çatalhöyük deserves to be called a city. It lacks the streets, public spaces, and monumental architecture we associate with cities. Yet by sheer scale it qualifies. Thousands of people living together, supported by farming and herding, with long-distance trade networks bringing in obsidian and other exotic goods. It may be more accurate to call it a town without streets, a unique experiment in dense communal living, one that stands apart from later urban traditions. Walking through Çatalhöyük, if we could, would have been a sensory overload. On rooftops, sunlight, smoke rising, voices echoing. Inside, dim rooms, plaster gleaming, paintings glowing red and black. The smell of cooking, the constant grind of stone querns, the presence of animals tethered outside or nearby. Beneath the floors, generations of the dead, their memory carried forward in new houses built on the same spot. It was a city of continuity, density and intimacy, a place where thousands of lives were lived side by side in a space without streets, and yet the haunting question remains. What was it like to live in a city that was just one endless roof? Did people feel liberated, walking above the world on a communal platform, or constrained, their lives enclosed within dim boxes beneath? Did the rooftop bring people together, or did it blur the lines between public and private too completely? We cannot know for sure. But Çatalhöyük reminds us that there are many ways to imagine urban life, and that the first towns were not simply smaller versions of later cities, but experiments of their own. Why mix your hearth with your gods? The homes of Çatalhöyük, occupied between about 7,100 and 6,500 years before the Common Era, force us to wrestle with this question again and again. Each house was at once a kitchen, a workshop, a bedroom, and a shrine. Daily life and ritual life were not separated into different buildings or even different districts, as they would be in later cities. Instead, they were fused together in the same rectangular rooms, beneath the same plastered walls, around the same hearths. To bake bread was also to sit in the presence of sculpted bulls' heads. To grind grain was to kneel before plastered reliefs, and to tend a fire was to warm a room whose walls once shone with red-painted figures. The integration of the sacred and the mundane in Çatalhöyük's architecture suggests that for these Neolithic villagers, life itself was a ritual, every act shadowed by symbolism. At the heart of each house was the hearth, located beneath the ladder that led in from the roof. Fires were lit here daily for warmth, cooking, and light. Beside them were ovens built against the walls, used for baking bread and preparing meals. Nearby, bins of grain and other foodstuffs were stored in dark side rooms. These were the engines of survival, the practical necessities of subsistence farming. And yet, they were not isolated from the ritual aspects of life. On the opposite side of the room from the hearths were platforms, often plastered and painted, raised above the floor. These were the spaces where family members slept, but also where symbolic installations were constructed. Animal skulls embedded in plaster, horns of wild aurochs arranged as if still living, wall paintings looming above. To sleep and wake in such spaces was to live surrounded by images that were more than decoration. They were reminders of forces beyond daily life, presences whose meaning we can only guess. In many houses, the contrast between the hearth side and the shrine side is striking. The area near the oven is practical, darkened with soot, crowded with tools and grinding stones. The area opposite is bright with plaster, smoothed and renewed many times, adorned with horns, reliefs, or painted motifs. Archaeologists describe this as a division between a dirty and clean side of the house, but those terms hardly do justice to the symbolic depth. It is more accurate to say that one side was associated with the labour of survival, while the other was associated with ritual presence. Yet both were contained in the same room. There was no separation of sacred and profane in space, only a balance, a juxtaposition. This pattern suggests that every family participated in ritual life, not as an occasional activity but as part of daily existence. When a woman knelt to grind grain on a quern, she did so in sight of the horned bull skulls on the opposite wall. When a man lit the fire in the oven, the plastered reliefs behind him reminded him that other forces, invisible but present, shared the space. Children grew up beneath painted figures and sculpted installations, learning that their home was not just a shelter, but a place of significance beyond the family itself. The ritual platforms also had other uses. Some contained burials beneath, layering the presence of ancestors literally under the sleeping surfaces of the living. Others were replastered many times even when the rest of the house showed little renewal, suggesting that their maintenance had symbolic importance. In some cases the plaster was painted red, perhaps to signify blood, renewal, or life. In others the surfaces were smoothed to a sheen, reflecting light from the fire. These were not casual decorations. They were maintained with care, suggesting a deliberate effort to keep ritual alive in the very core of the home. One of the more intriguing aspects of Çatalhöyük's houses is the way ritual imagery was standardized. Not every house contained the same installations, but across the settlement, repeated motifs appear. Bull's horns recur again and again, modelled in plaster, sometimes dozens of them in a single house. Wall paintings show similar animal scenes, geometric patterns, and abstract shapes. This suggests a shared symbolic vocabulary, known to the community at large. Each household expressed it in their own way, but the language of images was common. In this sense, the shrines were not private idiosyncrasies, but part of a wider ritual system, one that bound thousands of people together in shared practices. Archaeologists have often struggled to interpret this integration of shrine and hearth. In later cities, temples are separate from houses, and ritual specialists act apart from ordinary families. At Çatalhöyük, by contrast, there is no sign of such separation. Ritual was not centralized, and sacred spaces were not monumental. Instead, every family home contained shrines. This suggests a society where ritual was distributed, where the sacred was democratized, where every family participated directly. Whether this was an intentional rejection of hierarchy or simply a stage before centralization emerged is unknown. But it is clear that at Çatalhöyük, the gods, if that is what these presences were, lived in every household. The blending of fire and shrine also raises questions about how daily acts were perceived. Was cooking itself a ritual? Was the maintenance of the hearth an offering, a sacred duty? Many traditional societies view the hearth as the centre of spiritual life, a place where ancestors dwell, where offerings are made, where the household spirit resides. Çatalhöyük's architecture suggests something similar. The hearth was not just practical, it was symbolic, positioned at the entrance, aligned with shrines, integrated into the rhythms of ritual. To tend the fire may have been to tend the family's connection to the sacred. Another dimension is the sheer labour of maintenance, plastering walls and floors, embedding horns in reliefs, repainting motifs. These required time, effort, and skill. Families invested this labour not for comfort alone, but for meaning. That suggests that they valued ritual presence as much as, or more than, convenience. In a sense, the house was itself a shrine, renewed again and again through labour. The walls were not just walls. They were canvases for memory, surfaces of significance. This leads to the haunting question. What did it feel like to live in such a space? For us, the separation of sacred and profane is normal. We visit temples or churches, then return home to ordinary houses. For the people of Çatalhöyük, there was no such division. Home was temple, hearth was shrine, bed was burial. The gods, or ancestors or spirits, were not outside but inside, present in every plastered wall, every embedded horn, every renewed surface. Life was lived in constant proximity to the sacred. Why mix your hearth with your gods? Perhaps because in a world where farming was fragile, where disease lurked, where life was short, there was no clear line between survival and ritual. To cook, to eat, to sleep, to remember, to honour, all were parts of the same cycle. By integrating shrine and hearth, people may have been asserting that the forces that sustained them physically and spiritually were one and the same. The fire that baked bread also warmed the ancestors. The walls that held grain also held gods. In such a world, daily life was sacred because it had to be. Why do leopards prowl the walls of the first city? In the dim interiors of Çatalhöyük, occupied between about 7,100 and 6,500 years before the Common Era, some of the most vivid images ever painted in the Neolithic world flicker into view. Spotted cats leaping across plaster, their tails curved, their bodies exaggerated, their presence unmistakable. The leopard was a predator of great danger, rarely encountered but deeply feared. Yet here, on the walls of a dense settlement of thousands, leopards became a recurring symbol, joined by images of aurochs, red deer, vultures, and humans in tightly arranged hunting scenes. Why would the inhabitants of a farming town, surrounded by herds of sheep and fields of wheat, devote so much effort to painting animals they seldom hunted? The earliest excavator of Çatalhöyük, James Mellart, believed that these images represented an earth goddess, accompanied by leopards as attendants. He famously interpreted a clay figurine of a corpulent woman seated between two feline-headed armrests as a mother goddess, presiding over fertility and harvest. For decades, this goddess interpretation dominated popular imagination. Çatalhöyük as a matriarchal shrine, its leopard symbols of power and protection, its statues icons of a Neolithic cult. But later scholarship, especially under Ian Hodder's direction, has challenged and complicated this picture. Rather than a simple goddess cult, the imagery of leopards and other predators may reveal a more fluid set of beliefs, rooted in hunting, danger, and the liminal boundaries between human and animal. The walls themselves tell the story. In some houses, leopards are painted in pairs, facing each other, their bodies elongated and their spots exaggerated. In others, human figures appear near them, sometimes in postures of confrontation, sometimes entwined. The leopards are not decorative. Their repetition, scale, and placement suggest symbolic significance. They may have represented dangerous wildness, a reminder of the power that lay beyond the safety of the village. They may also have been emblems of transformation, beings whose predatory energy could be invoked, confronted, or contained within the house. Other images complicate the scene. Aurochs, giant wild cattle, appear painted in deep red, sometimes surrounded by human hunters wielding bows. These are not domestic cattle, which the inhabitants of Çatalhöyük kept in their herds. They are wild aurochs, far more dangerous, depicted at the moment of confrontation with hunters. Red deer appear as well, again in hunting contexts. Vultures are painted above headless human figures, echoing practices seen across the wider Near East, where excarnation, exposure of the dead to birds, was part of funerary ritual. Together, these motifs suggest a symbolic world where hunting, feasting, and death were central themes, even as the community depended more and more on farming. One striking detail is that domestic animals are almost absent from Çatalhöyük's imagery. Sheep and goats, the backbone of daily diet, are nowhere to be seen. Instead, it is the wild, dangerous animals that dominate: leopards, aurochs, stags, vultures. This suggests that the symbolic world of the settlement was oriented not toward the tame and controlled, but toward the wild and threatening. Perhaps because farming life felt vulnerable, exposed to drought, disease, and crop failure. The community projected its fears and hopes onto the wild. To paint a leopard on the wall was to acknowledge the existence of danger, but also to master it by representation. Hodder's excavations have emphasized the context of these images. They are not isolated art for art's sake. They occur in specific houses, often associated with platforms, installations, or burials beneath the floors. Some houses contain multiple layers of repainting, with leopard motifs appearing again after walls were replastered. This repetition suggests continuity of meaning over generations. Families may have renewed leopard images as part of commemorating rituals or seasonal ceremonies. The act of repainting was itself a ritual, ensuring that the leopard remained present in the household imagination. Mellart's goddess interpretation, though influential, seems less secure in light of these findings. The famous seated woman of Çatalhöyük, with her feline armrests, may not represent a deity at all. It may instead be part of a broader repertoire of figurines, many of which depict animals, humans, or hybrid forms. Hodder and colleagues note that thousands of animal figurines have been recovered from Çatalhöyük, dwarfing the number of human figures. Most of these are small clay models of cattle, sheep, goats, and wild beasts, often broken deliberately. They may have been used in rituals, perhaps during feasts, then discarded. The leopards, then, fit into a broader pattern of symbolic engagement with animals, not necessarily tied to a single goddess, but to a worldview in which humans, animals, and spirits were entangled. Feasting may provide another clue. Evidence of large-scale consumption of wild cattle has been found at Çatalhöyük, including butchery marks and concentrations of aurochs' bones in some houses. These feasts may have been social events that reinforced community bonds and resolved tensions. Leopard imagery may have been part of this symbolic system, representing the danger and prestige of hunting, the transformation of wild power into communal sustenance. In this interpretation, painting leopards on the wall was not about worshipping a deity, but about inscribing the memory of shared feasts and hunts, about keeping the energy of the wild within the domestic sphere. There is also the possibility of shamanic transformation. Some images depict humans in animal postures, or animals with human traits. In one painting, a human figure appears with exaggerated genitals alongside a bull, perhaps representing a ritual performance. In another, leopards flank human forms, as if the boundary between predator and person was porous. Such images may reflect beliefs in transformation, where humans could take on animal qualities, or where animals embodied spirits that could cross into the human world. The leopards on the walls may have been more than images. They may have been presences, portals, or companions in ritual journeys. The reassessment of Çatalhöyük's imagery under Hodder's team has shifted emphasis away from fixed interpretations and toward fluidity. Rather than a single goddess cult, the evidence suggests multiple overlapping practices: feasting, hunting symbolism, ancestor veneration, shamanic transformation. The leopards may have meant different things in different contexts, their significance layered and renewed over centuries. What we can say is that they mattered enough to be painted, replastered and painted again in houses where people lived and died. The haunting question remains, why leopards? Why this predator, more elusive than wolves, less economically significant than cattle, yet chosen to dominate walls? Perhaps precisely because of its elusiveness. The leopard embodied the untamed, the dangerous, the unknown, forces that farming could not control. To paint it was to bring it into the home, to contain it, to acknowledge its power while asserting human presence. The leopard's tale, then, is not only about an animal. It is about how the first townspeople saw themselves, caught between the wild and the domestic, between danger and security, between death and survival. Were animals gods, food, or something in between? That is the dilemma faced when we step into the world of the 8th and 7th millennia before the Common Era. Across the Near East, in villages that relied more and more on farming, we find a remarkable persistence of animals in symbolic life. Sheep and goats were tethered, pigs were corralled, cattle were slowly being domesticated. Yet when people carved, sculpted and painted, the animals they turned to most often were not the docile herds in their pens, but the wild creatures that continued to command awe. Aurochs, with their massive horns, appear again and again in plaster installations. Bulls' heads are set into house walls, their horns protruding into domestic space. Small figurines of cattle, goats, and gazelles are made in their thousands, then often discarded or broken. At feasts, wild cattle were slaughtered and consumed on a scale far beyond daily diet. The evidence suggests that animals were not simply resources but beings with whom humans had a complicated, symbolic relationship, occupying a space between food, spirit and presence. At Çatalhöyük, the most famous of the Neolithic megasites, this entanglement is most vividly preserved. Many houses contained installations where the skulls of aurochs, wild cattle, were embedded into plaster walls. Sometimes dozens of horns were arranged in elaborate patterns, jutting into the living space, giving the impression that the walls themselves were alive with bulls. These were not the skulls of domesticated cattle, which were rare in this period, but of wild aurochs hunted in the nearby steppe. To bring the head of such an animal into the house was to bring in its power, its danger, its spirit. Archaeologists have debated whether these were trophies of hunts, symbols of feasting, or sacred presences. Perhaps they were all three. In any case, they suggest that the aurochs held extraordinary significance, far beyond its role as occasional food. The feasts associated with these skulls reinforce the point. At Çatalhöyük, concentrations of aurochs' bones, heavily butchered, suggest that entire communities gathered to consume wild cattle together. These were not everyday meals. Sheep and goats provided daily sustenance. Aurochs' feasts were exceptional, marked events that required coordinated hunting and ended with ritual deposition of remains. The skulls mounted in houses may have been permanent reminders of these events, anchoring social memory in bone and plaster. Each horn embedded in a wall carried not only the image of the animal, but the memory of the hunt, the feast, the gathering of people in celebration and danger. Elsewhere, similar practices appear. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, small clay figurines of animals, especially cattle, have been found in significant numbers. Some are stylized, others more naturalistic, but their sheer quantity indicates a ritual role. These figurines were often found in contexts suggesting deliberate deposition, sometimes broken intentionally, as if their power had to be released. At Tel Aswad in Syria too, animal figurines dominate assemblages, again suggesting widespread symbolic use. The figurines may have been used in rituals tied to feasting, to hunting, to herding, or to the invocation of animal spirits. Their breakage suggests that they were not mere decorations, but objects of temporary significance, created for a moment, then discarded. At Kayanu in southeastern Anatolia, the presence of animal remains in ritual context reinforces the theme. In one building, an aurochs skull was deposited in a central location, apparently as part of a larger installation. In another, feasting debris suggested communal gatherings focused on wild cattle. These finds echo the pattern seen at Çatalhöyük. Animals, especially large and dangerous ones, at the heart of ritual life. Why this persistent focus on animals that were becoming less central to diet? By the 8th millennium, daily survival in many villages was tied more to cultivated crops and domesticated sheep and goats than to hunting. Yet when people turned to ritual, they chose wild cattle, deer, leopards, vultures. One explanation is that wild animals represented the untamed world beyond the village, a source of danger and vitality that farming could not replace. To invoke them was to acknowledge forces outside human control, forces that remained powerful even in an agricultural setting. Another explanation is that wild animals embodied prestige. To hunt an aurochs required skill and courage. To host a feast with its meat was to display power and generosity. Mounting its horns in a house was to proclaim that connection for all to see. The figurines add another layer. They may have been used to teach, to rehearse, to symbolize. A clay bull could embody a real bull's spirit in a ritual without requiring the presence of the animal itself. Breaking the figurine may have symbolically enacted the killing of the animal, a ritual hunt in miniature. Thousands of such figurines suggest that this was not an occasional practice but a widespread repeated ritual act, deeply embedded in community life. It is also possible that these animals were not simply symbols, but participants in a shared cosmology. Many later traditions in the region, from Mesopotamian myths to Anatolian cults, feature animals as divine companions, emblems, or embodiments of gods. The aurochs in particular remained a powerful symbol for millennia. Perhaps in the Neolithic the boundary between animal and deity was already blurred. The horns embedded in walls may not have represented a god through an animal, but the animal itself as a divine being. Yet we must remain humble. We cannot know for certain what these animals meant to those who lived 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. All we have are bones, figurines, plaster, and paint. But what we can say is that animals refused to leave these people alone. Even as farming and herding took over daily life, wild beasts occupied their imagination, their rituals, their walls. Animals were not simply food, they were presences, forces, companions in the symbolic life of the first villages. The haunting question is whether animals were gods, food, or something in between. Perhaps they were all at once. To eat an aurochs was to share in its power, to mount its skull was to honour its presence, to sculpt its form was to invoke its spirit. The Neolithic villagers did not separate these categories as neatly as we do. For them, the boundary between human and animal, sacred and profane, was porous. Animals walked into their houses not only in flesh but in plaster, clay and bone, and once there, they never truly left. Why would anyone want to sleep above a corpse? That question haunts almost every excavation of the Near Eastern Neolithic. From Jericho in the Levant to Çatalhöyük on the Anatolian plain, archaeologists have lifted plaster floors and discovered what lies beneath. Human skeletons, crouched tightly as if asleep, wrapped in mats or shrouds, sealed into the earth under the very spaces where daily life unfolded. In some houses, there are one or two such burials. In others, entire clusters of individuals rest together beneath platforms that once served as beds or benches. The people who lived in these houses cooked, ate, worked, and slept directly over the bodies of their own dead. Far from being an anomaly, this was the norm across centuries of the 8th and 7th millennia before the Common Era. The practice seems to have begun in the early Pre-Pottery Neolithic and persisted across regions. At Ain Ghazal in Jordan, burials were found beneath house floors, placed in fetal positions with knees drawn tightly to the chest. At Abu Huraira, the reoccupied settlement on the Euphrates, the same pattern appears. At Çatalhöyük, the layering of generations over centuries created deep sequences of burials beneath platforms, each house holding its own small necropolis. What united these sites was not grandeur or monumentality, but the intimacy of death woven into the very spaces of daily life. The bodies were not laid out flat but curled, often bound tightly. This fetal position may have symbolized rebirth, the return to a womb-like posture, or perhaps simply reflected the practicalities of burial in confined spaces. Some individuals were interred alone, others in small groups. Infants and children were often buried beneath ovens or in side rooms, while adults tended to lie beneath main room platforms. This suggests differentiation in practice, though whether by age, status, or family ties is uncertain. What is clear is that burial was not separate from domestic life, but part of it. Plastering played a critical role. Floors at these sites were repeatedly plastered, often dozens of times, with layers of lime sealing not only the surface of the house, but also the bodies beneath. Archaeologists suggest that one reason for this constant renewal was hygienic. Plaster sealed in the smell and decay of decomposing corpses. But it may also have been symbolic, an act of closure, renewal and remembrance. To plaster a floor was not simply maintenance. It was also an act of sealing the dead into place, making their presence both contained and eternal. Each new layer both concealed and commemorated those below. The presence of burials under floors also raises questions about memory. These were not forgotten graves hidden outside settlements. They were intimate reminders of kin, kept within the household. To sit on a platform was to sit above one's ancestors. To walk across a floor was to walk over the dead. Children grew up knowing that beneath the surfaces of their homes lay generations of family. The house was not just a shelter, but a vessel of memory, layered in both architecture and ancestry. Not every person was buried beneath a house. At Çatalhöyük, for instance, only a fraction of the population seems to have been interred in this way. Many individuals are missing from the archaeological record, suggesting other methods of disposal, perhaps exposure, cremation, or burial outside the settlement. Those selected for inclusion beneath house floors may have been chosen deliberately. Were they elders, important figures, or simply family members claimed by a household? The criteria are unclear, but the act of choosing mattered. Those under the floor were the ones remembered daily, integrated into the rhythms of life. There are also hints that some burials were reopened. In certain cases, skeletons show signs of disturbance, as if bones were rearranged or removed. This may have been for secondary burial elsewhere, or to retrieve skulls for ritual use. But even without such modifications, the very act of burying beneath floors meant that the dead remained accessible, physically present within the household structure. They were never entirely gone. From a modern perspective, the idea of sleeping above a corpse is unsettling. But for Neolithic villagers, it may have offered comfort. Death was not a departure to a distant realm, but a return to the house, to the family, to the continuity of generations. The living and the dead shared space, one above, one below. The house was both dwelling and tomb, both shelter and shrine. The implications for social life are profound. If each house contained its own burials, then houses were more than architectural units. They were lineages, genealogical anchors. To build a new house on the remains of an old one was not simply practical, but symbolic. Families literally lived atop their ancestors, tying themselves to place through both architecture and burial. The mound of Çatalhöyük grew not only from collapsed walls, but from accumulated generations of the dead beneath. The settlement was a collective landscape of memory, rising higher with each generation. Other aspects of burial reinforce this sense of integration. Grave goods are rare, but when present they tend to be modest, beads, tools, or small ornaments. This suggests that status differences were not strongly marked in burial, or at least not through lavish offerings. Instead, the emphasis was on presence, on keeping the dead close rather than displaying wealth. The uniformity of practice across sites suggests a shared worldview in which ancestors were woven into daily life without monumental differentiation. We must acknowledge what we cannot know. Were the dead seen as protective, watching over the living? Were they feared, requiring containment beneath plaster to prevent their return? Were they honoured as part of a cycle, joining the soil that sustained the crops above? Archaeology cannot answer these questions definitively. What it shows us is the physical integration of the dead into domestic space, a pattern repeated again and again across centuries. And so the haunting question remains: why would anyone want to sleep above a corpse? Perhaps because to do so was not disturbing, but reassuring. To lie down at night in Çatalhöyük or Jericho was to know that beneath you lay the bones of parents, grandparents or children, sealed into the earth, present in the home. Life and death were not separate spheres, but layers of the same house, one stacked upon the other. For the first villagers of the Near East, the dead were not gone. They were simply below, silent but enduring, part of the architecture of life. Why rebuild a face over and over? In the centuries between roughly 8,500 and 6,500 years before the Common Era, communities across the Near East developed one of the most haunting practices in all of prehistory. They exhumed the skulls of the dead, stripped them of flesh, and then remade their faces in plaster. Layer after layer of lime was carefully modelled to recreate cheeks, noses, and brows. Shells or pebbles were pressed into place for eyes. Pigments of red and black were applied to suggest skin, hair, and detail. When the plaster flaked or cracked, it was renewed, smoothed again, repainted. Some skulls show many cycles of resurfacing, as if their faces were being brought back repeatedly, refusing to fade into anonymity. This was not an isolated quirk, but a widespread phenomenon, found from Jericho in the southern Levant to Ain Ghazal in Jordan, to Tel Aswad near Damascus, to Sayonu in Anatolia. Archaeologists now call it the skull cult, a term that can sound melodramatic but captures the strange devotion with which these communities treated the crania of their dead. The clearest examples come from Jericho, one of the longest continuously occupied settlements of the region. In a series of excavations, archaeologists unearthed skulls whose features had been rebuilt in astonishing detail. One shows a nose carefully modelled, lips suggested by slight plaster ridges, and eyes formed from shells placed within sockets. Another had layers of pigment applied across the plaster surface, the colours still faintly visible thousands of years later. These were not rough approximations. They were deliberate attempts to preserve individuality, to give the skull of the deceased a face once more. And when the surface wore down, the faces were remade, as if death could not erase the presence of the person beneath. At Ain Ghazal, similar practices appear but on an even larger scale. There, alongside the famous life-size statues buried in pits, skulls with plastered faces were also discovered. Some were modelled with extraordinary care, their eye sockets filled, their foreheads smoothed. In certain cases, layers of plaster suggest that the skulls were used and displayed for extended periods before being interred again. They were not made once and forgotten, but maintained as ongoing objects of memory and reverence. At Tel Aswad too, plastered skulls appear, part of a pattern that stretched across hundreds of kilometres. This was not a local eccentricity. It was a shared tradition that linked communities across the Fertile Crescent. The technical effort involved was immense. To plaster a skull required first the preparation of lime, itself a demanding process that involved quarrying limestone, burning it at high temperatures and mixing it with water. This labour-intensive material was then applied in layers, smoothed and sculpted by hand. Pigments of red ochre or black bitumen were ground and painted onto the surface. The skull had to be stabilised as work progressed. All of this effort was devoted to individuals who had already died, suggesting that memory and presence were powerful enough to demand as much labour as the construction of a house or shrine. What was the purpose of these plastered skulls? One interpretation is that they were a way of preserving memory. In societies where writing did not exist, and where oral tradition carried the weight of history, remaking the face of a deceased ancestor allowed their presence to continue within the household. The skulls may have been displayed in homes, perhaps placed on platforms or niches, reminding families daily of their forebears. Another possibility is that they were used in communal rituals, brought out during ceremonies, feasts, or rites of renewal. Their careful burial in groups suggests that they had a life cycle, displayed for a time, then interred collectively when their role was complete. The repetition of plaster layers is particularly telling. Some skulls show as many as half a dozen resurfacings, suggesting that they were maintained across years, even decades. Each replastering may have been part of a ritual of remembrance, performed on anniversaries or at seasonal gatherings. To rebuild a face was to affirm continuity, to resist the erasure of time. It was an act both of love and of power, binding the living to the dead, the present to the past. The spread of the skull cult also raises questions about cultural connection. How did communities hundreds of kilometres apart come to share such similar practices? Was this a diffusion of ideas across networks of trade and kinship? Or was it a case of independent invention, societies across the region grappling with the same challenges of memory, identity and death, arriving at similar solutions? We do not know. But the shared presence of plastered skulls in so many settlements suggests that whatever their meaning, it resonated widely. At Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, the skull cult took a particularly dramatic form. In one building, archaeologists found a cache of skulls deposited together, some treated with plaster, others plain, all placed within a substructure. Nearby, evidence of animal blood poured over deposits suggests rituals of intense symbolism, where human remains and animal sacrifice were intertwined. Here the skulls may have been more than memory objects. They may have been part of a larger system of ritual power, mediating between human communities and forces beyond. The eerie realism of the plastered skulls cannot be ignored. To stand in a museum today and look at one of these objects is to feel an uncanny sensation. A face, thousands of years old, staring back, its eyes recreated in shells, its nose sculpted anew. It is a presence that feels alive and yet is unquestionably the remnant of death. For the people of the Neolithic, this uncanniness may have been the point. To remake a face was to make the dead present, to bring them into the house, to let them watch and be watched. We should also recognize what we cannot know. Were these skulls honored as ancestors, venerated for their wisdom and lineage? Were they feared, contained in plaster to prevent their spirits from wandering? Were they tokens of status, preserving the visages of important individuals? Or were they part of a broader cosmology, where life and death interwove and faces had to be rebuilt to ensure continuity? The evidence leaves room for all of these interpretations. What is undeniable is that the plastered skulls show a devotion to memory unlike anything seen before. And so, we return to the haunting question. Why rebuild a face over and over? Perhaps because forgetting was too dangerous, and memory too precious. In villages where generations lived and died in the same houses, to plaster a skull was to acknowledge that the dead were still part of the community. Their faces could not be allowed to fade, their eyes could not be left empty. By remaking them again and again, people ensured that the dead continued to watch, to be present, to live in some way. The skull cult may unsettle us today, but for those who practiced it, it was a way of ensuring that faces would never truly die. Why does the vulture always wait for the head? Across the villages and shrines of the early Neolithic, from the limestone enclosures of Göbekli Tepe to the mud brick houses of Çatalhöyük, imagery of decapitation and vultures occurs again and again. Figures are painted or carved without heads, while above them vultures hover, wings outstretched, sharp beaks poised. At Jericho on the Euphrates, a subterranean chamber was found with a headless body placed within, accompanied by animal bones and ritual deposits. At Çatalhöyük, wall paintings show human forms lying prone, their heads missing, while vultures circle above. Even at Göbekli Tepe, where towering T-shaped pillars dominate, fragments of human skulls bear cut marks, and a relief shows a headless man with an erect phallus, beside a bird that scholars cautiously identify as a vulture. This repeated pairing of missing heads and scavenger birds suggests that the early agriculturalists of the Near East had a particular relationship with the processes of death, decomposition, and exposure. Excarnation, the practice of leaving bodies exposed to be consumed by birds and animals, is well documented in later cultures. From the Tibetan plateau to the Zoroastrian towers of silence, archaeologists now suspect that the Neolithic communities of the Fertile Crescent engaged in similar practices. Bodies may have been left on platforms or open ground, allowing vultures to strip away flesh. The removal of heads, which are found separated from bodies in many burials, could have been part of this process. Once the flesh was gone, skulls could be retrieved, plastered, and kept within houses, as we saw in the plastered skull tradition. The vulture imagery, then, may be less about horror and more about a recognised stage of the journey from death to memory. The emphasis on heads in particular is striking. Many wall paintings and reliefs show headless torsos, but the missing head is not accidental. The head was the seat of identity, the locus of memory and recognition. To remove it was to separate the essence of the person from the body. The body might be given to vultures, returning to nature, while the head was curated, transformed, and retained. The vulture thus appears as the intermediary, the agent of this transition, consuming the body and leaving the skull behind for the living to reclaim. At Çatalhöyük, one famous wall painting shows vultures looming over small, headless human figures. The humans are painted in a pale tone, their arms outstretched, their heads absent. Above them, the birds spread their wings in a dominating posture. Archaeologists debate whether the scene depicts an actual funerary practice, exposure of bodies to scavengers, or whether it is symbolic, representing death, transition, or rebirth. Either way, it connects the imagery of vultures with the absence of heads, reinforcing the idea that these birds were companions in the process of excarnation. At Göbekli Tepe, the association is no less dramatic. The relief of the headless man beside a bird is one of the most enigmatic images at the site. Some scholars argue that the bird is indeed a vulture, and that the scene reflects the removal of heads as part of ritual death practices. Others caution that we cannot be sure, that the imagery may be mythological rather than literal. But when combined with the cut-marked skulls found at the site, the interpretation of excarnation becomes plausible. Jerf El Ahmar offers another piece of the puzzle. There, in a subterranean building filled with ritual deposits, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a headless body buried with a single skull in a pit, the entire chamber then set on fire. This sequence, removal of the head, ritual deposition, burning, suggests a complex choreography of death, in which decapitation and perhaps exposure played a role. Why vultures? Partly because of their ecology. In the Near East, vultures were, and still are, common scavengers, circling above open ground, descending on carrion with speed and efficiency. Their presence would have been familiar to Neolithic villagers, who likely observed them feeding on wild animals and perhaps on exposed human remains. Unlike predators such as wolves or leopards, vultures consume quickly and leave bones relatively intact. This made them ideal partners in incarnation. To leave a body to the vultures was to accelerate decomposition while preserving the bones, especially the skull. There may also have been symbolic associations. Vultures soar high, riding thermals, appearing to descend from the heavens. To watch them lift from a corpse into the sky may have seemed like a spirit ascending. The vulture could have been imagined not only as a consumer of flesh, but as a carrier of souls. Its role in death was both destructive and transformative, reducing the body while elevating the spirit. In this sense, the repeated depictions of vultures may reflect reverence as much as fear. The deliberate decapitation of bodies adds further depth. Cut marks on skulls from Çatalhöyük, Tel Aswad, and other sites indicate that heads were sometimes removed after soft tissue had decayed, suggesting a planned ritual rather than a violent act. The separation of head from body combined with vulture imagery points to a two-stage funerary process. First exposure, then retrieval of the skull. The plastering of skulls described earlier may have been the final stage. The vulture, then, was the hinge between decomposition and commemoration. We cannot, of course, claim certainty. These interpretations are grounded in archaeological traces, not written texts. We do not know if Neolithic people saw vultures as psychopomps, guides of the dead, or simply as practical agents of flesh removal. What we can say is that the imagery of headless bodies and hovering birds was widespread, recurring across regions and centuries. That repetition suggests significance. These were not random decorations. They were symbols that carried weight across generations. There is also a haunting intimacy to the imagery. The headless human figures at Çatalhöyük are small, vulnerable, dwarfed by the looming vultures. They remind us that in this worldview, death was not sanitized or hidden. It was raw, visible, entwined with the natural cycle of consumption and decay. To live in these villages was to know that death meant exposure, that the birds above were waiting, that one's head might be taken and remade. The presence of such images in homes suggests that this knowledge was not concealed, but integrated into daily life. Children grew up beneath these paintings. Families sat by hearths, in rooms where vultures and headless figures gazed down. The question remains, why does the vulture always wait for the head? Perhaps because the head was never truly theirs. Flesh could be given to the birds, but the skull belonged to the living, reclaimed and transformed into a vessel of memory. The vulture, in this sense, was a partner in the process, never the final owner. The head was taken back, plastered, painted, preserved. The bird fed, the family remembered, and the cycle of death and continuity was maintained. What we see in these images, then, is not only horror, but also a system of meaning. Death was not an end, but a transformation, mediated by scavenger birds, completed by human hands. The vulture was a participant in ritual life, a symbol of passage, a necessary companion in the journey from body to ancestor. And so the Neolithic villagers painted them again and again, reminders that the sky was full of wings, waiting to complete the work of death. Were these the first elites, or just unlucky neighbours? That uncomfortable question arises whenever we look closely at the plastered skulls of the early Neolithic. Across the Levant, Syria and Anatolia, only a fraction of the dead was selected for this extraordinary treatment. At Jericho, for instance, hundreds of burials have been excavated, but only a small number of plastered skulls have been recovered. At Ain Ghazal, amid the many burials beneath floors, a few skulls were retrieved and elaborately remodelled with plaster and paint. At Sayonu, caches of skulls appear in ritual substructures, again representing a limited portion of the population. These were not universal practices applied to every deceased member of a community. They were selective. And so we ask, what made one skull worth keeping and another left to decay? Was this the beginning of social inequality, the first sign of special treatment for certain individuals, or was the selection based on traits invisible to us, appearance, circumstance, or misfortune? One hypothesis is that plastered skulls represent the earliest elite. In this view, the individuals whose skulls were retrieved and displayed were community leaders, elders, or ritual specialists. Their skulls were preserved because they carried authority in life and were expected to continue providing symbolic power in death. If true, this would suggest that the skull cult reflects not only ancestor veneration, but also the emergence of hierarchy. Keeping certain skulls would have reinforced lineages, elevated particular families, and made social difference visible in ritual form. Supporting this idea is the labour investment involved. Plastering a skull was not a casual act. It required lime production, sculpting, pigment, and repeated maintenance. To devote such effort implies significance. Just as monumental architecture reflects the coordination of communal labour, so too might plastered skulls reflect decisions about whose memory deserved such investment. Perhaps the skulls were focal points for households or lineages, their display asserting continuity of authority. In this sense, plastered skulls could be among the earliest material signs of inequality in human history. But other interpretations resist this conclusion. Some scholars argue that selection may not have been about status, but about representativeness. Certain skulls may have been chosen because they displayed physical traits valued by the community. Strong jaws, prominent brows, symmetrical features. Others may have been chosen because they belonged to family members, their skulls retrieved for household shrines. In this view, the skull cult was not about elites, but about kinship and identity. The dead whose faces were remade were not leaders, but ancestors, chosen to anchor family memory. Evidence complicates the picture. At Ain Ghazal, plastered skulls include both male and female individuals, and across sites we find skulls of adults of varying ages. This diversity suggests that selection was not limited to a narrow class of leaders, nor do we see lavish differentiation in other aspects of burial. Grave goods are generally sparse, and even in settlements with clear evidence of large communal buildings, most burials remain modest. If inequality was emerging, it was not yet marked by wealth in burial. The skull cult may therefore reflect symbolic choices rather than formal hierarchy. Yet the possibility of inequality cannot be dismissed. Smith and colleagues have argued that as farming economies developed, inheritance and land ownership became increasingly important, leading to structural inequality. In that context, plastered skulls could have functioned as markers of lineage claims. A skull on display was not only a face of memory, but also a claim to land, house, and heritage. To remake a face was to say, this person lived here, and through them we belong here. The act of preserving certain skulls may therefore have tied into property and inheritance, foreshadowing the stratification that would later become obvious in Bronze Age societies. It is also worth considering the unsettling possibility that selection was arbitrary. In some cases, skulls show signs of removal not long after death, as if chosen by chance or circumstance. Perhaps some were taken because they were accessible, or because their graves happened to be reopened. Others may have been chosen for reasons now invisible: personal conflicts, ritual needs, or simple availability. In that case, the skull cult may not reflect inequality so much as the unpredictable nature of ritual practice. Archaeologists continue to debate. What remains clear is that the skull cult was selective, and that selectivity mattered. Whether it reflected emerging elites, family memory, physical traits, or arbitrary choices, it created difference. Some individuals were remembered with plastered faces and shell eyes, their presence renewed again and again. Others were not. That division, whatever its basis, is one of the earliest material signs of social differentiation we can trace. We should also acknowledge the ambiguity. To interpret plastered skulls as evidence of inequality is tempting, but it may also be projecting later categories onto earlier societies. The Neolithic was a period of transition, when farming was new, villages were growing, and ritual practices were still fluid. The skull cult may have been less about hierarchy than about grappling with death, memory, and the problem of continuity. To us, the faces seem eerie, selective, perhaps elitist. To them, they may have been acts of care, inclusion, and remembrance. The haunting question remains: were these the first elites, or just unlucky neighbours? Perhaps both. Perhaps the skull cult marks the moment when communities began to differentiate, when memory became selective, when not all faces were allowed to endure. Whether driven by status, lineage, or circumstance, the plastered skulls remind us that even in the earliest villages death was not equal. Some skulls were worth keeping, and others were not. That choice, whatever its reasoning, was the beginning of something that would echo through the rest of human history. Did food make us farmers, or did farming make us feast? This is one of the central puzzles of the Neolithic. For much of human history, food had been a matter of survival, sought each day through foraging and hunting. But in the early villages of the Near East, food became more than sustenance. It became a medium of social life, a way to negotiate status, cement alliances, and mark transitions. Archaeology reveals that some of the earliest large-scale communal events centered on feasting, on the slaughter of animals, the preparation of vast amounts of grain, and even the brewing of fermented drink. These occasions were not mere meals. They were orchestrated spectacles, moments when food was redistributed, consumed in excess, and transformed into power. Evidence for this shift stretches back even into the late Epipaleolithic. At Rakfet Cave in the Carmel Mountains of Israel, archaeologists discovered mortars dated to around 13,000 years before the present, used not only to grind plants but to prepare a fermented beverage. Residues of starch grains and plant matter suggest that these people brewed a proto-beer, perhaps for ritual feasting. The site is also associated with Natufian burials, indicating that these gatherings may have been tied to funerary events. Already, long before full-scale agriculture, people were experimenting with turning food into ritual spectacle. Beer, bread, and feasting were intertwined with death and memory. By the time villages spread across the Fertile Crescent, between 8 and 7,000 years before the Common Era, feasting had become a recurring pattern. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, and Çatalhöyük, concentrations of animal bones, often from wild species such as aurochs or deer, suggest large-scale communal slaughter. These deposits differ from everyday refuse. They show selective hunting of large game, butchered en masse, consumed together. Such events required planning, cooperation, and a deliberate surplus of effort. They were not necessary for survival. They were necessary for social life. Why feast? One explanation is that feasting acted as a social glue. Villages were growing larger, populations denser, tensions more likely. Gathering people together to consume food in abundance, often accompanied by ritual-reinforced community ties. Sharing meat and drink created bonds, smoothed conflicts, and reminded participants of their shared identity. Another explanation is more cynical. Feasting was a tool of power. Those who could sponsor a feast, by organizing a hunt, providing grain, or slaughtering livestock, displayed their wealth and influence. To feed others was to demonstrate control over resources. Feasts could thus become arenas of competition, where households or individuals vied for prestige. Archaeological evidence supports both views. At Çatalhöyük, for example, feasting deposits include the remains of dozens of slaughtered animals, far beyond what a single family could have consumed. Such scale implies communal participation, but also centralized organization. At Göbekli Tepe, analysis of plant remains suggests large-scale serial processing, far more than required for daily use. Combined with evidence for wild animal consumption, this indicates gatherings where food was deliberately prepared for large groups. At Çatalhöyük, concentrations of wild cattle bones suggest that aurochs hunts ended in feasts where entire neighborhoods participated. These events were opportunities for collective memory, but also for households to display their role in organizing and providing. The connection between farming and feasting is particularly intriguing. Some archaeologists argue that the demands of feasting may have driven the intensification of agriculture. If hosting a feast required large amounts of grain or animal products, then cultivating crops and herding animals became necessary to sustain such events. In this view, farming was not simply adopted for subsistence, but for social reasons, for the ability to host, to feed, to gain prestige. Others suggest the reverse, that once farming created surpluses, feasting emerged as a way to consume and redistribute them. Either way, the link between the two is clear. Farming and feasting evolved together, each reinforcing the other. We can also see the symbolic role of feasting in the treatment of animals. At many sites, wild species were chosen over domesticated ones for communal consumption. Daily diets may have relied increasingly on sheep and goats, but feasts featured aurochs, deer, and boar. This suggests that feasting was not only about abundance, but about spectacle, danger, and the invocation of wildness. To kill and consume a massive wild bull was an event worth commemorating. Its bones, often placed deliberately in buildings, became permanent reminders of the feast. Food was not just eaten, it was transformed into symbol, into memory, into presence. The connection between feasting and ritual is also strong. Many plastered skulls and figurines have been found in contexts associated with food preparation or consumption. At Ain Ghazal, feasting deposits occur near communal buildings that also housed ritual statues. At Çatalhöyük, platforms associated with feasts also contained burials and installations of animal skulls. This intertwining suggests that feasting was not only social but sacred. To eat together was to participate in ritual, to honour the dead, to renew ties with ancestors and spirits. Yet feasting had consequences. To slaughter dozens of wild cattle required hunting pressure that could not be sustained indefinitely. To host repeated feast required surpluses that demanded ever more labour. In some cases, the drive to feast may have strained resources, leading to cycles of abundance and scarcity. Archaeologists debate whether this dynamic contributed to the eventual decline of large sites. What is clear is that feasting was not incidental. It was central to the way early farming societies organised themselves. We should be cautious not to romanticize. These were not egalitarian banquets where everyone shared equally. The very act of providing food for others created distinction. Who hunted the animals? Who organised the harvest? Who distributed the portions? These were moments where power was visible, where inequality could be enacted under the guise of community. Feasting both united and divided, bonding people while reinforcing differences in access and control. The haunting question lingers. Did food make us farmers, or did farming make us feast? Perhaps both. The desire to gather, to consume in abundance, to mark transitions with shared meals, may have been one of the strongest forces driving the shift from foraging to farming. Once farming made surpluses possible, feasting only grew in scale. The Neolithic was a long experiment in how food could be more than nourishment. It could be memory, ritual, prestige, and power. In the end, feasting may have bound communities together, but it also pushed them toward the limits of what their land and labour could provide. Why did the first mega-villages fall silent? By the middle of the 7th millennium before the Common Era, the vast communities that had flourished across the Near East began to contract, falter, and in some cases vanish altogether. Sites that had once housed thousands, places like Ain Ghazal in Jordan, Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, and Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, saw their populations dwindle or their houses abandoned. The walls of Jericho no longer rang with the sounds of thousands. The dense rooftop maze of Çatalhöyük thinned and spread apart. What had seemed like the triumphant expansion of farming and urban living suddenly entered a period of decline. Archaeologists have searched for explanations, and while no single cause can be pointed to with certainty, a convergence of factors emerges from the evidence: environmental stress, overuse of land, and the strains of growing inequality. The most dramatic environmental factor was the so-called 8.2 kilo-year event. Around 6,500 years before the Common Era, global temperatures fell abruptly, triggered by the sudden drainage of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic. This disrupted ocean circulation and sent ripples through climate systems worldwide. In the Near East, the result was a shift to cooler and more arid conditions. For communities dependent on farming, this meant crop failures, reduced yields, and heightened vulnerability. Evidence from lake cores and speleothems in the region shows clear signatures of drought and cooling. What had been marginal land for farming became untenable. But climate alone cannot explain the scale of decline. The very success of early farming villages had created vulnerabilities. Fields around megasites had been cultivated year after year, exhausting soils that had little time to regenerate. Without rotation or fallowing, fertility diminished. Erosion increased as forests were cleared for fields and grazing. What began as rich alluvial land became overworked and unproductive. Archaeobotanical evidence shows declines in cereal quality in the later Neolithic layers, and zooarchaeological data reveals stress on herds. Goats, the most resilient domesticates, began to dominate assemblages, suggesting that communities were leaning heavily on hardy animals to compensate for failing crops. At the same time, social pressures mounted. As villages grew into towns and towns into sprawling megasites, not everyone benefited equally. Some scholars argue that inheritance and land ownership began to consolidate, with certain households accumulating privileged access to fertile plots. Smith and colleagues have suggested that the shift to farming economies made inequality inevitable, as property and lineage became more central to survival. If true, then the plastered skulls and ancestor rituals we have already examined may not only have been acts of remembrance, but also acts of claim, assertions of belonging tied to land and resources. Over time, such inequality could have fostered resentment, tension, and fragmentation. The evidence of abandonment is striking. At Ain Ghazal, which had grown to cover 15 hectares and house several thousand people, the population began to plummet in the century after 1,500 years before the Common Era. Excavations show that large areas of the settlement were deserted, while remaining households clustered into smaller quarters. The magnificent statues and plastered skulls that once marked its ritual life ceased to be made. At Abu Huraira, a site occupied for millennia, the Neolithic village contracted, and by the end of the 7th millennium before the Common Era, it was largely deserted. At Çatalhöyük, a settlement that had been occupied since the 9th millennium, layers show a clear break, with buildings abandoned and no subsequent reoccupation. What must it have felt like for these communities to collapse? Imagine growing up in a dense settlement, surrounded by hundreds of houses, only to watch neighbours depart, fields fail, and ritual traditions wane. The great communal buildings fell silent. The feasts of wild cattle dwindled. The plastered skulls, once maintained carefully, were buried and forgotten. People dispersed into smaller, more scattered villages, moving into hills, valleys, and new lands where the pressure of scale was less suffocating. Archaeologists debate the relative weight of climate versus human choices. Some argue that the 8.2 kilo-year event was decisive, overwhelming fragile farming systems. Others emphasize that these societies were already straining at the limits of their land, and climate was merely the final push. Still others suggest that internal social tensions, inequality, disputes over property, overburdened households played just as significant a role. What we can say is that decline was not uniform. Some sites persisted, adapting to new conditions while others fell rapidly. The collapse was patchy, reflecting the diversity of strategies and vulnerabilities across the region. It is also possible that decline was not experienced purely as disaster. For many households, dispersal into smaller settlements may have been a relief. Freed from the burdens of supporting thousands, from the endless cycle of plastering floors and renewing houses, from the obligations of feasting and ritual display, smaller communities may have found greater balance. What archaeologists call collapse may have been experienced by some as escape, as a return to more manageable scales of life. And yet, the memory of the great settlements lingered. The mounds of abandoned megasites remained on the landscape, silent monuments to the first experiment in living at scale. Their lessons were not forgotten. When new centres arose in later millennia, from Mesopotamian cities to Anatolian towns, they built upon both the achievements and the failures of these Neolithic predecessors. The Great Decline of 6,500 years before the Common Era was not the end of complex settlement, but a pause, a recalibration, a moment when humanity stepped back from the brink and reconsidered how to live together. The haunting question remains, why did the first megavillages fall silent? Perhaps it was climate, sudden and harsh. Perhaps it was exhaustion of soil, the land rebelling against overuse. Perhaps it was inequality, tearing apart the fragile fabric of community. Most likely it was all of these together, converging into a storm that early farmers could not withstand. In their silence we hear both warning and wisdom. The first great settlements of humanity remind us that growth is fragile, that abundance can turn to scarcity, and that the very practices that sustain us can also undermine us. The Neolithic decline was not failure. It was a reminder that every beginning carries its own risks and every rise its shadow. What happens when you can finally boil your food? That deceptively simple question opens a door into one of the quiet revolutions of the Neolithic world. For thousands upon thousands of years, human meals were roasted on open flames, baked in pits, or ground into flour and cooked as flatbreads. Liquids could be warmed in hides or baskets by dropping in heated stones. But this was awkward, fragile, and limited. Around the middle of the 7th millennium before the Common Era, people in the Near East began shaping clay, hardening it with fire, and creating vessels that could withstand both heat and time. Suddenly, food could be boiled, stewed, and stored in durable containers. Diets changed, technologies multiplied, and identities were written into the very surfaces of these vessels. We know that pottery was not invented in the Near East. Hunter-gatherer groups in East Asia were producing ceramic vessels as early as 20,000 years before the present, with fragments from Xianrendong Cave in southern China showing that the craft emerged long before agriculture. In the Sahara, too, some of the earliest pottery in the world dates to the 10th millennium before the Common Era, used by foragers who combined fish and wild plants in ceramic cooking pots. What is distinctive about the Near East is how pottery emerged relatively late, after the establishment of farming villages, and then spread rapidly as those communities reorganized after the decline of the megasites. The earliest pottery in the Near East appears around 6,500 years before the Common Era, at sites across northern Syria, southeastern Anatolia, and the Levant. In the beginning, the vessels were simple, hand-shaped, low-fired, often with thick walls and uneven surfaces. They were not yet thrown on wheels, a technology that would only appear thousands of years later. But they were durable, able to hold water, grains, or stews. Some bear traces of food residues, showing that they were indeed used in cooking. Their arrival coincides with a new rhythm of life, one in which food could be stored for longer, meals could be more varied, and households had vessels that outlasted a single season. The practical impact of pottery was immense. For the first time, boiling became a common cooking technique. Tough grains could be softened into porridge, meat and legumes could be stewed together, making more digestible meals. Bone collagen could be extracted into broths. Infants and the elderly could be fed softer foods, improving survival. Archaeological studies of residues show that milk was sometimes processed in pottery, suggesting that dairy consumption expanded with this technology. What had once been laborious and limited became routine, changing the very texture of daily meals. Pottery also transformed storage. Grain, legumes, and dried food could be kept in sealed containers, safe from rodents and insects. Liquids could be stored without leakage. This extended the range of surplus, allowing households to plan further ahead and weather seasonal shortages. The shift from baskets, skins, and stone vessels to fired clay was not just a technical change, but a social one. It allowed greater permanence, accumulation, and control over food. The cultural dimension is no less important. From their earliest appearance, pottery vessels carried decoration. Simple incised lines, impressed patterns, and painted motifs appear on Neolithic sherds. These were not necessary for function. They were statements of identity. Different regions developed distinctive styles, which archaeologists now use as cultural markers. In northern Syria, geometric incisions dominate. In the southern Levant, painted lines appear earlier. In Anatolia, impressed chord patterns became common. These motifs were more than decoration. They were signals of belonging, visible every time a vessel was used or displayed. The spread of pottery also mapped onto shifting settlement patterns after the great decline of the megasites. As people dispersed into smaller villages, pottery styles diversified. Each community adapted the craft in its own way, creating a patchwork of designs across the region. Some vessels were traded, carrying motifs from one area to another, serving as silent ambassadors of connection. Others remained local, tied to the rhythms of a single valley or river plain. The first pots thus not only changed cooking, but became canvases for cultural expression. We should also note the persistence of older practices. Pottery did not immediately replace baskets, gourds, or stone bowls. Those remained in use for generations. Pottery was heavy and breakable, less suited for transport than lighter containers. But within settled villages, its advantages outweighed its drawbacks. Over time, it became the dominant medium for cooking and storage, its fragments accumulating in middens and floors, leaving behind the durable record that archaeologists now rely on to trace cultural change. The timing of pottery's emergence in the Near East may also reflect social needs after the decline of the great settlements. As communities restructured into smaller villages, new ways of marking identity and sustaining households became important. Pottery provided both. It allowed more flexible cooking and storage, supporting households through variable conditions. And it offered a medium for artistic expression, embedding cultural symbols in everyday life. In this sense, the first pots were not just containers, but companions in the reorganization of society. The question of whether pottery was invented or adopted remains open. Some argue that it spread from eastern neighbours, inspired by traditions in the Zagros or even further east. Others see independent invention, a natural outcome once people had clay, fire, and the need for durable vessels. The truth may be a mix, local innovation influenced by long-distance awareness of what others were doing. What matters is that once the idea took hold, it spread rapidly, becoming a hallmark of Neolithic culture. What happens when you can finally boil your food? Meals change, households change, and cultures begin to inscribe their identity onto clay. The first pots were simple, but they were revolutionary. They made porridge possible, stews common, and surplus more secure. They carried designs that marked belonging and difference, and they left behind a record more durable than stone walls or wooden beams, a record that still speaks to us today. Pottery was not loud or monumental, but it was transformative, a quiet technology that reshaped the daily life of humanity. The haunting resolution is that pots outlived their makers. Every vessel, once shattered, became a shard, preserved in the soil for thousands of years. From these fragments, we reconstruct the meals, the identities, and the rhythms of lives long past. In the humble first pots of the Near East, we glimpse not only a technological shift, but a profound human story. The moment when clay, fire, and hunger combined to change civilization. If this was not yet civilization, then what was it? Between 6,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, the peoples of the Near East lived in societies that sit uneasily between categories. They were not foragers in the older sense, wandering after herds or collecting wild seeds, nor were they yet citizens of cities, with rulers, writing, and bureaucracies. They were something in between, inhabiting villages that grew and shrank, farming fields that sustained both plenty and want, and conducting rituals that kept the dead close beneath the floor. It was a forgotten revolution, one that does not always draw the attention of the later empires or dynasties. But without it, none of those later civilizations could have come into being. By 6,000 years before the Common Era, pottery was in daily use, and the rhythms of life had changed. Grains were cultivated systematically, legumes and flax were staples, and herds of sheep, goats, and cattle grazed the landscapes around villages. Populations had rebounded after the declines of the 8th millennium, spreading into new regions and experimenting with new ways of living. In the highlands of Iran and the Zagros, villages sprouted on previously empty plateaus. Along the Levantine coast, smaller sites replaced the earlier mega-settlements. Across Anatolia, communities reorganized in more dispersed patterns. These changes were adaptive responses to centuries of stress and collapse. But they were also creative. The Neolithic did not end in silence. It evolved into something new. The paradox is that these societies fulfilled many of the criteria we associate with civilization, yet they are rarely called such. They had architecture on a massive scale, stone ritual buildings, plastered houses, densely packed neighbourhoods. They had symbolic systems of remarkable complexity, from painted shrines to plastered skulls to decorated pottery. They had economies based on farming and herding, capable of supporting thousands in one place. They had trade networks reaching across hundreds of kilometres, moving obsidian, shells, malachite and timber. What they lacked were writing, rigid social hierarchies, and the bureaucratic apparatus that would emerge later. Civilization, as we tend to define it, would come with cities like Uruk around 4,000 years before the Common Era. But these earlier societies had already laid down nearly everything that made those cities possible. One of the most striking features of this forgotten revolution is its intimacy with death. Unlike later civilizations, which often separated the dead into cemeteries, these Neolithic communities kept the dead within the home. Beneath floors, under platforms, sometimes even beneath the hearth, bodies were interred in crouch positions, wrapped in mats, then plastered over. The living walked, cooked, and slept above them. The skull cult carried this intimacy even further. Selected skulls were retrieved, remodelled with plaster and pigment, and displayed or buried again, sometimes repainted multiple times. The ancestors were not remote figures, but presences integrated into daily life. Even in decline, even as megasites thinned and dispersed, this practice continued. The revolution of the Neolithic was not only about farming, it was about a new way of remembering, binding generations together through material memory. The art of these communities is equally telling. From the faceless statues of Ain Ghazal to the painted vultures and headless men at Çatalhöyük, imagery proliferated. It is often enigmatic, resistant to our interpretations. Are the plaster statues gods, ancestors, or something else? Were the leopard reliefs deities, spirits, or simply the celebration of powerful animals? We do not know. What we do know is that meaning was everywhere. Walls were plastered and replastered, painted and repainted, as if the act of renewal was as important as the images themselves. Ritual was not confined to temples, but woven into houses, kitchens, and shrines. The sacred and the domestic were not separate realms, but overlapping ones. This integration is part of what makes the period difficult to classify. These were not civilizations with priests ruling over laity. They were communities where the spiritual and the ordinary intermingled in every space. Trade, too, reveals the paradox. Obsidian from Cappadocia appears in settlements hundreds of kilometres away. Mediterranean shells turn up in inland houses. Beads of malachite and turquoise travelled across regions. These networks suggest a degree of connection, exchange, and perhaps even diplomacy that foreshadows later city-states. Yet they lack the formal institutions of later trade. There are no merchant records, no tariffs, no archives. Goods moved, but how they were negotiated we cannot say. Perhaps through gift exchange, perhaps through ritual, perhaps through early forms of barter. It was complex, yet still informal. The question of inequality lingers over this forgotten revolution. Did these societies already contain elites, or were they still largely egalitarian? The evidence is mixed. Plastered skulls and statues hint at selectivity, at certain lineages claiming special memory. Houses at Ain Ghazal and Çatalhöyük vary in size and richness, but not dramatically. Grave goods are sparse, without the ostentatious wealth of later tombs. If inequality was emerging, it was subtle, woven into ritual and memory rather than displayed through material excess. These were not yet kingdoms, but the seeds of hierarchy may have been sown. The technological shifts of this period are equally crucial. The adoption of pottery changed cooking and storage. The spread of domesticated crops and animals solidified farming as the foundation of life. Tools became more specialized, with polished stone axes and sickles becoming common. Architecture grew more standardized, with rectangular houses dominating across regions. All of these innovations were incremental, but together they transformed how humans lived. They created permanence, stability, and the possibility of accumulation. They also created new vulnerabilities, as people became tied to land, herds, and houses in ways that foragers never had. So if this was not civilization, what was it? Perhaps the best term is the village revolution. These communities were the crucibles in which farming, ritual, art, and social organization were forged. They were experiments, some successful, some not. Ain Ghazal flourished, then declined. Çatalhöyük rose to prominence, then dispersed. Jericho grew, fell, and grew again. Each tells us that the path to civilization was not straight, not inevitable, but full of reversals. The forgotten revolution was messy, fragile, and uncertain, yet it was also the foundation on which later civilizations would be built. The haunting image with which we close is of the skulls beneath the floor. They remind us that these people lived with their dead, renewed their faces, and built their lives on memory as much as on farming. The skull cult is not simply a curiosity. It is a metaphor for the entire Neolithic. These societies lived above their ancestors, literally and symbolically, layering new generations over old, plastering and replastering the world they inhabited. In that sense, the forgotten revolution was not forgotten at all. Its memory persisted, passed down in traditions, myths, and perhaps in the very rhythms of village life that shaped later civilizations. If this was not yet civilization, then what was it? It was the moment when humanity turned inward, stayed in one place, cultivated the land, built houses and shrines, remembered their dead, and created meaning in every wall and vessel. It was not a city, not a state, not yet a civilization in the strict sense. But it was the necessary threshold, the place where all the future paths of humanity began. And as we leave this world behind, we might imagine the silent gaze of the skulls, still watching from beneath the plaster floors, as if to remind us that our beginnings are buried there, in the houses of the first farmers, in the forgotten revolution. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.